I'd like to call this hearing to order this morning. Today, the subcommittee is having the hearing to explore President Obama's climate change action plan. And I certainly want to thank the Secretary of Energy, Mr. Moniz, and Gina McCarthy, our new administrator at the Environmental Protection Agency, for joining us this morning. And I want to be sure we start the clock so that I don't speak forever, because that'd be pretty boring for everybody. But I do want to thank you two for being with us this morning. I will tell you that I'm extremely disappointed that we sent letters to the Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Department of the Interior, Department of State, Transportation, Ex-Im Bank, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, because they're very much involved in this action plan as well, and they did not send witnesses to testify. Now, in June of this year, President Obama went to Georgetown University, and he gave his speech in which he announced a climate change action plan for America. And in that speech, he mentioned that he was tired of excuses for inaction. Now, I'm just going to tell you, I take exception to that, because in his action plan, he included many of the component parts of the cap-and-trade legislation that was considered by the Congress in 2009, the Waxman Markey bill. And that legislation passed the House, but it did not pass the U.S. Senate. So rather than inaction on the part of Congress, Congress made a decision, and that was that it did not want to adopt that legislation. So I understand the President's view on climate change. Now, I would like to predicate this by saying worldwide CO2 emissions last year amounted to 800 gigatons. Of that, 30 gigatons were caused by humans. That's 3.75% of all worldwide emissions come from human activity. So the question becomes, if you have a broad spectrum of action on this plan, and we know that it's one of the President's priorities, and we know that in the last 4 or 5 years we spent $70 billion on an action plan, or climate change. This year we expect to spend $22 billion. So what we're focused on this morning is we want to know more about the plan. Is it going to contribute to higher energy costs? Is it going to raise unemployment rates? Is it going to create obstacles to economic growth? Is it going to have an impact on our ability to compete in the global marketplace? And I specifically wanted to read from some headlines in newspapers around Europe and elsewhere about this issue. And all of these were within the last 3 months. Support for the European Union's climate and energy policy eroded further Friday as the Czech Republic became the latest member to denounce subsidies for clean but costly renewable energy and pledge to use more fossil fuels. Europe's industry is being ravaged by exorbitant energy costs. Europe's quixotic dash for renewables is pushing electricity costs to untenable levels. We can't sacrifice Europe's industry for climate goals that are not realistic. The European Union's energy and climate policy is in disarray and losing credibility. Utilities are turning to coal and cheap lignite, emitting more CO2 than ever. Europe faces a crisis in energy costs. As you know, the new government in Australia, as their first order of business, have decided to repeal the carbon tax legislation. They also plan to abolish the Climate Commission, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and the Climate Change Authority. Now, so far, this year, 2012, in the year 2012, 375 coal units at power plants in America are closing, 294 of them because of EPA regulations. The first half of 2013, 151 coal mines in America have closed. So this is a discussion today. We recognize we have different views on this, but we are trying to make a sincere effort to understand the ramifications, the impact of climate change. As a Congress, we have the responsibility, with all of this money being spent, to get a better feel of what is the government really doing, because it is comprehensive. It spreads throughout the entire government, and this hearing is about, we want to know what's going on, and we're going to go back to every one of those agencies that I mentioned earlier, whether we sit down with them individually or as a committee. We want to know and understand precisely what is going on. So once again, Mr. Secretary and Madam Administrator, thank you for being with us. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is the first time in a long time that this committee is holding a hearing on climate change. And I welcome this hearing, and I want to commend Chairman Upton and Chairman Whitfield for holding it. Climate change is the biggest energy challenge we face and a clear and present danger to the United States and to the world. I also commend the administration for sending Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz and EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy to testify. It's unusual to have two cabinet secretaries testifying at a subcommittee hearing. Your presence makes it clear how seriously the administration is taking this hearing. As Secretary Moniz explains in his statement, the scientific evidence is overwhelming. That's why the President released a comprehensive climate action plan in June. His plan is reasonable, it's affordable, and it will protect our atmosphere for our children and future generations. It will make our country the global leader in the clean energy economy of the future. In past hearings and markups and in debates on the floor, Republicans on this committee and in the House have opposed many elements included in the President's plan. Last Congress, the House voted 53 times to block action on climate change. This Congress, the House has already voted to slash funds for research into clean energy and energy efficiency. House appropriators voted to eliminate funding for international negotiations on a climate treaty. And our committee even refused to listen to the scientists. Over the last 2 years, Subcommittee Ranking Member Rush and I have written 27 letters requesting hearings on climate change, and until today, no hearing was ever scheduled. I hope today will mark the start of a change in approach. That's why my question for House Republicans is simple. What's your plan? If you don't like the President's plan, what's your proposal? The President has said he's willing to listen to other ideas for protecting our planet and fulfilling our moral obligation to future generations. What are yours? Yesterday, I held a forum with the members of the Safe Climate Caucus to hear from Americans who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change. From California to New York, from Iowa to Texas, we heard stories of wildfires, droughts, floods, sea level rise, and record temperatures. Their accounts were moving and powerful. These extreme weather events are happening now, and they are costing lives, destroying livelihoods, eliminating jobs, creating billion-dollar disaster relief legislation. We need to start addressing this enormous threat now. The longer we wait, the more damage we will cause, the more deeply we will need to cut carbon pollution, the bigger the bill will be for taxpayers, and the further we will fall behind China and Germany in the race to develop the new energy technologies of the future. The President was right. We don't have time for another meeting of the Flat Earth Society. Saying no to every solution is not a plan. Doing nothing is not a plan. If all the Republicans on this committee do today is criticize, they're either denying the science or ignoring it. No one can accept what the scientists are telling us and fail to support a plan of action. That's why I hope we can move past denial and start a constructive dialogue. Secretary Moniz and Administrator McCarthy have both told me they want to work with the stakeholders in implementing the President's plan. They would welcome working with Congress, especially with this committee, which has vast jurisdiction over our nation's energy policies. We should listen closely to their testimony today. Where we disagree, let's offer alternative solutions. The climate clock is ticking and too much is at stake for more politics as usual. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this chance for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. At this time, I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is about oversight of the President's climate change policies and activities, and it is disappointing that 11 agencies, which had ample notice to identify witnesses, including scientists, and work with staff to accommodate them on different panels, chose instead to decline our request. Climate policy is a central feature of this administration's energy policy, and given the billions, tens of billions of dollars currently being spent on climate activities, there's no good reason for so many agencies to decide that they cannot testify before this committee. When the administration first attempted to impose its climate policies on the American public through the cap-and-trade legislation, we needed a reality check. And at that time, it was noted that without meaningful international participation, jobs and emissions would simply shift overseas, and there would be no meaningful impact on global carbon emissions or the temperature changes that they may result from those emissions. Other nations would continue to seek to grow their own economies and would naturally take advantage of U.S. economic and manufacturing weaknesses. We heard that firsthand in this committee. Last week, the Labor Department reported that there are still 11.3 million people unemployed, including 4.3 million long-term unemployed and 7.9 million involuntary part-time workers whose hours have been cut back or are unable to find full-time jobs. It makes no sense to impose an ineffectual and economically harmful energy policy, one, I would remind folks, that was rejected through the front door here in the Congress by Senate Democrats. Unfortunately, the administration is now working to circumvent Congress through the back door, seeking to regulate what it was unable to legislate, no matter, perhaps, what the cost to jobs or the economy really is. Thoughtful oversight is necessary so that the public can understand more clearly what is happening and what the impacts of the administration's climate policies may be. And I believe that it is a disservice to the public to suggest a policy approach will meaningfully address climate risks when, in fact, it will not, despite tens of billions spent and countless jobs lost. So today, with the help of the private innovation and America's newfound energy abundance, the U.S. indeed is the envy of the world as it relates to energy access and the safe and responsible development of energy resources. We stand at the very threshold of profound economic opportunity for the nation and future generations. So we should pursue constructing a new architecture of abundance as a central feature for future economic strength and to provide the economic foundation to address climate risks. There should be no question that the economic wherewithal fostered by America's energy resurgence will provide a wide avenue for innovation that will answer energy and environmental challenges of the future. Yes, it is good to have Secretary Moniz and Administrator McCarthy before us this morning. You two stand at the center of energy policy in this nation, and your agencies will play either positive or negative roles to ensure a strong, vibrant, and innovative energy sector in the future. My interest is to understand how you intend to address the new realities of American energy abundance, what your respective agencies' roles should be in promoting access to abundant, affordable energy resources that are so necessary to meeting future challenges and making our nation more competitive. I look forward to having that discussion, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time, recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair Whitfield, for holding this very important hearing. The International Panel on Climate Change will soon issue its latest report summarizing the findings of recent climate science. That report is likely to reiterate the message they sent us 5 years ago. Greenhouse gases continue to rise in the atmosphere. The planet is warming, sea level is rising, and a significant degree of this change is attributable to human activities. We're seeing the impacts already. Higher sea levels create more perilous conditions when hurricanes approach the coast. Higher temperatures enhance drought conditions, creating significant losses for farmers and ranchers, and set the stage for more intense, widespread forest fires. Our infrastructure, our communities, and our economy are all vulnerable to these changes. Add to these facts that our infrastructure is aging, and we are neglecting to maintain the very systems that we rely on to support a modern, thriving society. We can continue along our current path, leaving states and local governments to fend for themselves, patching things together as they wear out, are damaged, or are destroyed. Or we can use the tremendous intellectual and entrepreneurial resources that we have to address the challenge of climate change. Our current path of inaction leaves tremendous opportunities for job creation, for social progress, and for economic growth untapped. It wastes resources, especially human resources. President Obama realizes this and has offered a modest, balanced plan to reduce greenhouse gases and to rebuild and redesign the modern and resilient infrastructure that we require for the future. The administration's plan seeks to realize the potential of new, cleaner energy technologies. At the same time, the plan recognizes the important role that fossil fuels play in our economy. We continue to use these fuels, as will other nations, but that does not mean we need to use them inefficiently or without regard to the increasing risk that they pose for the future of our planet. Our citizens could be employed building our 21st century transportation, energy, and water infrastructure. Our manufacturers could be supplying the parts and equipments for a modern electric grid, a high-speed rail, wind farms, combined heat and power systems, energy-efficient vehicles, fuel cells, and advanced batteries. Other nations are moving forward, incentivizing and assisting their industries and positioning themselves and their citizens for the future. They are thinking long-term, while we subject our nation to unnecessary austerity and an endless series of stopgap funding bills. This is not the bold and inspired thinking that created this nation and made it the great nation that it is. No one set out to change the chemistry of our atmosphere and set our planet on a new climate trajectory. But it has happened, and we must act. Act now to slow this process and adapt to the new conditions. The President's plan is a fine start. I'm very pleased that we have Secretary Moniz and Administrator McCarthy here with us today. These two officials and their agencies are tasked with a great deal of responsibility for making this plan a success. Thank you both for being here this morning. I hope this is not our last hearing on this topic and that we will have additional opportunities to hear from other federal agencies. There's a lot of work to do, and we have wasted too much time already. Thank you again, Chair Whitfield, for holding this very important hearing, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I'd like to recognize, we'll begin with Secretary Moniz, 5 minutes for his opening statement. And once again, Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us this morning. Be sure and turn your microphone on.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Waxman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the President's Climate Action Plan, and in particular, the DOE's role in its implementation. I'll start with saying, again, the evidence is overwhelming, the science is clear. The threat from climate change is real and urgent, and the basic science behind climate change is simple. Carbon dioxide makes the Earth warmer, and we are emitting more and more of it into the atmosphere at a rate that has long been understood to have a material, cumulative impact on a scale measured in decades, not centuries. This increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases, above all from the combustion of fossil fuels, is affecting the climate. Carbon dioxide is particularly important, both because of the magnitude of the emissions and because it is long-lived in the atmosphere. Again, all of this was known a long time ago What was not anticipated was the pace at which energy needs would grow to serve 7 billion people on the planet with rapid industrialization. Every ton we emit now irreversibly commits our children and grandchildren to the risk of climate disruption. Now, while we cannot attribute any particular storm, for example, to climate change, cumulatively we can say that rising sea levels, increasingly severe droughts, heat waves, wildfires, and major storms are amplified by a warming climate. This is already costing our economy billions of dollars a year, and common sense and prudence demand that we take action. So that's the driving force behind the President's Climate Action Plan, and its 3 pillars are to cut carbon pollution domestically, to prepare for the worsening impacts of climate change, and to lead international efforts to combat climate change and prepare for its impacts. My main focus today will be on what the U.S. can do domestically to reduce carbon pollution, and in particular on DOE's role in the Climate Action Plan. Of course, many other agencies have critical roles as well. First, we must use our energy more intelligently. I'm committed to energy efficiency, both to achieve reductions in carbon emissions and to reduce energy bills for families and businesses. The Department of Energy also plays a central role in developing the low-carbon technologies of the future. Coal and natural gas will remain significant sources of energy in the years to come, and that's why DOE has issued a draft solicitation for $8 billion in loan guarantees for advanced fossil energy technologies that reduce carbon emissions. In addition, DOE has already committed $6 billion on clean coal technologies, all with the goal of enabling the use of fossil fuels in a carbon-constrained world. Some of the most impressive energy developments in recent years have been in renewable energy technology. DOE recently released a paper called Revolution Now that outlines some of these critical clean energy developments for wind, solar, LEDs, and EV batteries. The key message is the pattern of dramatic cost reductions, strong government RD&D and supportive policy, and rapidly increasing deployment, much like the story of unconventional natural gas production that unfolded over the last 30 years. A clear indicator of the nascent energy system transformation is the business model evolution taking place in the utility sector in response to energy efficiency and renewable energy market trends. Changes in energy technologies take time, sustained investment, and stable policies. Even in this age of budget austerity, we need to ensure that we continue to invest in clean energy. As part of the President's Climate Action Plan, the Department of Energy will also assist in the development of the Quadrennial Energy Review. Now, while we must take action to reduce the carbon pollution that causes global warming, impacts from climate change are already here and more are on the way. Let me highlight just one project that demonstrates how we are approaching this in terms of infrastructure resilience. In the aftermath of Sandy, the vulnerability of our electricity and fuels infrastructure to severe storms and flooding was evident. Recently, I was in New Jersey to sign an MOU with Governor Christie and the New Jersey Transit Corporation to design a microgrid that will provide reliable distributed power for a critical transportation corridor. This is an example of the sort of smart infrastructure we will need throughout the country, and this can provide a first-of-a-kind example for the nation. It also exemplifies our commitment to work more closely with states and local governments. The third part of the President's plan is leading international efforts to address climate change. A global effort will be required to limit future climate damages. Here at DOE, we are focused on helping countries around the world expand the use of clean energy, improve energy efficiency, and strengthen global preparedness and resilience to climate change. While the State Department has the lead on international negotiations, such as phasing down HFCs, domestic clean energy success will allow America to lead by example and at the same time to open up business opportunities for U.S. companies as a huge global market for clean energy opens up over the next decade. In conclusion, history has repeatedly shown that we can grow the economy while making tremendous strides in reducing pollution. We will need our smartest scientists, our brightest engineers, and visionary policymakers to get this done. The President has put forth a smart and prudent plan to slow global warming, to prepare for worsening climate impacts, and to ensure a safer, healthier future for our children and grandchildren. And I might add, my grandchildren are 8 and 10 years old, so I'm excited to be part of the President's plan to reduce the risks of climate change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Madam Administrator McCarthy, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Congressman Waxman, members of the committee. I should be on. Should I get closer? All set now? Thank you. In June, the President reaffirmed his commitment to reducing carbon pollution when he directed many federal agencies, including the EPA, to take meaningful steps to mitigate the current and future damage caused by carbon dioxide emissions and to prepare for climate changes that have been set in motion. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time. More than 97% of climate scientists are convinced that human-caused climate change is occurring. If our changing climate goes unchecked, it will have devastating impacts on the United States and on our planet. Responding to climate change is an urgent public health, safety, national security, and environmental imperative that presents an economic challenge as well as an economic opportunity. Both the economy and the environment must provide for current and future generations. We can and must embrace cutting carbon pollution as a spark for innovation, for job growth, clean energy, and economic growth. The nation's success over the past 40 years makes clear that environmental protection and economic growth do go hand in hand. The President's Climate Action Plan directs federal agencies to address climate change using our existing authorities. The plan has 3 key pillars: cutting carbon pollution in America, preparing for impacts of a changing climate, and leading international efforts to combat climate change. EPA plays a critical role in the plan's first pillar, which is cutting carbon pollution. Over the past 4 years, EPA has begun to address this task. In 2010, EPA and the National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration, along with the auto industry and other stakeholders, we worked together to set greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards for model years 2012 to 2025 light-duty vehicles. Over the life of those vehicles, the standards will save an estimated $1.7 trillion for consumers. It will cut America's oil consumption by 12 billion barrels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 6 billion metric tons. EPA emits the standards for model year 2014 through 2018 heavy-duty trucks and buses present a similar success story. Under the President's plan, we'll be developing a second phase of heavy-duty vehicle standards for post-2018 model years. Building on that success, the President asked EPA to work with states, utilities, and other key stakeholders to develop plans to reduce carbon pollution from both future as well as existing power plants. EPA will soon propose carbon pollution standards for future power plants, reflecting new information and the extensive public comment that we received on our 2012 proposal. For existing plants, we're already engaged in outreach to states and a broad group of stakeholders with expertise who can help inform the development of proposed standards, which we expect to issue in June of 2014. Using these standards, states will have the primary role in developing and implementing plans to address carbon pollution from existing plants, allowing us to capitalize on state leadership and innovation while accounting for regional diversity and providing ample flexibility. The plan also calls for the development of a comprehensive strategy to address methane emissions. EPA will work with other agencies to reduce methane emissions through incentive-based programs. The President's plan also calls for a broad array of actions to strengthen America's resilience to climate impacts. EPA will incorporate research on impacts into implementation of its existing programs and will develop information and tools to help decision makers, including states, localities, and tribes, to better understand and address the current effects and the future effects that we know are coming in a changing climate. EPA is working closely with our federal agency counterparts on building national resilience, including developing the National Drought Resilience Partnership, ensuring the security of our freshwater supplies, and protecting our water utilities. The President's plan recognizes that we must couple action at home with leadership abroad. Working closely with the State Department, EPA will continue to engage our international partners in efforts to reduce carbon pollution through activities including public-private partnership efforts to address methane emissions and other short-lived climate pollutants. In conclusion, the President's plan provides a roadmap for federal action to meet the challenges of a changing climate, to promote clean energy solutions that capitalize on American innovation and that drive economic growth. Thank you again, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Madam McCarthy. And before I begin my questions, I would like to ask unanimous consent to introduce a few relevant documents into the record. I would like to enter 1, the President's Climate Action Plan, 2, the invitation letter sent to the federal agencies requesting witnesses today, the Majority Committee staff hearing memorandum. In addition, I'd like to enter the special supplement to the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, released this month and entitled Explaining Extreme Events of 2012 from a Climate Perspective, excerpts from the Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook 2013, including a chart reflecting world energy-related carbon dioxide emissions 1990 to 2040, and a table reflecting world carbon dioxide emissions by region and country for 1990 through 2040, and finally an article entitled Making Energy Access Meaningful, published this summer in the National Academy of Sciences publication Issues in Science and Technology. Without objection, the documents will be entered into the record. And at this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Recently, during the August break, I spent time at some universities in the state of Kentucky. And in talking to students, one of their major concerns was trying to find a job upon graduation. And I started thinking about that, and I went back and I looked at the last 62 years of the unemployment rate in America. And the last 4 years, 2009 through 2012, the unemployment rate has been higher in America than at any time in the last 62 years except for 3 of those years. Now, in his speech to Georgetown University, the president specifically said that as we transition, try to make this transition, which we know cannot be done overnight. And the president frequently talks about an all-of-the-above policy, but America is the only country in the world where you cannot build a new coal-powered plant because the emission standards cannot be met because the technology is not available. And we know that regulations on existing plants are going to be coming out in 2014 in June. But in that speech, the president said that, in talking about his action plan, that we must provide special programs for people who lose their jobs. And as I quoted, there have been significant closures of electricity production plants using coal, and over 151 coal mines have been closed. So I would ask either one of you, what are the special plans in the President's action plan to help address these people who are losing their jobs because of these policies?
Mr. Chairman, let me begin. I just want to indicate that I think that I am sensitive, and certainly the Environmental Protection Agency has been sensitive, that as we pursue our mission to protect public health and the environment, we have to be sensitive to the economic consequences of our actions.
But Ms. McCarthy, do you know specifically what plan is in effect? He talked about we're going to have the special plans to address the concerns of these people who lose their jobs.
I'm not familiar with the details of those plans, but I am familiar from reading the Climate Action Plan that the President sees this as both a challenge as well as an economic opportunity for this.
Now, in looking at the chart, the organization chart for the Climate Action Plan, I noticed that there is one chart under the Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy referred to as the Greene Cabinet. How does the Greene Cabinet differentiate from the regular presidential cabinets?
Mr. Chairman, so the Greene Cabinet denotes that there are occasional meeting of principals from the agencies who have special responsibility in the Climate Action Plan. So we can get together and discuss coordination of programs, make sure there are not duplications. So it is a subgroup of the cabinet who, again, meets periodically together with key White House presidential assistants to discuss the general set of issues around climate.
And who is the person at the Secretary of Energy responsible for the coordination of all the task forces relating to climate change in the government?
Well, of course, I consider myself as having ultimate responsibility.
Yeah, but
but
you've designated
the action officer, if you like, is my chief of staff, Kevin Knobloch, who is keeping track of all of our responsibilities under the CAP.
Kevin Knobloch.
Yeah.
And Ms. McCarthy, who's your designated person for this?
Again, I have ultimate responsibility. We have two primary components. We have a mitigation strategy, which we're managing out of our office in air and radiation primarily. That would be Janet McCabe, who is currently the acting assistant administrator. On the adaptation side, which is looking at climate resilience and preparedness, we have our Office of Policy that is directed by Associate Administrator Michael Gu.
Now, I noticed the GAO, or in the budget, there's $22 billion allocated for climate change action plan for 2013. How much of that money will be allocated to EPA?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Mr. Chairman?
There's $22 billion planned to be spent in 2013, fiscal year 2013. How much of that money was allocated to EPA?
I can't answer that question, sir, but I'm happy to follow it up.
Do you know from the Secretary of Energy's position, Secretary Moniz, how much of the 22
Well, I think
billion?
the problem, first of all, is how one counts. For example, if we count our energy efficiency programs, which of course have the objective of saving money, and also would be good part of the solution for climate change, well, then let's add $1 billion there. So if we talk about all the programs that are helpful for climate change, then we're talking about $5 billion, mostly in our R&D budget. But as I say, most of that is for efficiency, nuclear power, clean technologies. Actually, we can throw in fusion. The one exception, one might say, is the substantial resources we devote to carbon capture and sequestration, specifically to make coal competitive in a low-carbon world.
Thank you. My time has expired. Recognize Mr. Waxman for 5 minutes question.
Secretary Moniz, in your testimony, you described the dangers we face from climate change. Is it too late to protect the planet from the worst effects of climate change?
Well, first of all, I think it's clear we cannot avoid implications. We are seeing them today. And my view, this decade is the critical one that we need to move out smartly and smartly.
How much time do we have? Can we afford to wait to act?
It will be a long-term commitment, but we have to act in this decade because, as I said, the CO2 problem is cumulative, and every ton we emit you can check it off against our children and grandchildren.
My concern is that we're facing this urgent threat, but all Congress is doing is getting in the way. This Congress has rightly been called the do-nothing Congress, but on climate, we're doing worse than nothing. We are affirmatively obstructing progress. Administrator McCarthy, you've been accused of leading a war on coal, but in 2009, the President supported market-based legislation to make major carbon pollution reductions while investing $60 billion to develop clean coal technologies like carbon capture and sequestration. Isn't that right?
That's my understanding.
The chairman said that this is the only country in the world where new coal plants cannot be built. You haven't released any regulations to prevent coal plants from being built, have you?
We have not, no.
At the time, our bill was criticized for being too generous to the coal industry. But virtually all the Republicans on this committee and the coal industry opposed the legislation despite its massive investment in that industry. We wanted to invest in innovative approaches so that coal could still be used, but Republicans opposed us. Last year, I tried a different approach. I wrote an op-ed calling for an emissions fee that would put a price on carbon. I even said that I would support using the revenues raised to reduce other taxes. But Republicans in the House also opposed this approach. Republicans outside the House, some of them supported it. In fact, House Republicans opposed every idea that has been raised for addressing climate change. Administrator McCarthy, you promulgated regulations last Congress reducing carbon pollution from cars and trucks. House Republicans voted to strip you of the authority to regulate those emissions. Isn't that right?
That is my understanding.
And they also voted to strip EPA of authority to regulate carbon pollution from power plants. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Secretary Moniz, I've heard some Republicans say that they like the idea of energy efficiency. But when I look at their record, they voted to block enforcement of requirements for energy-efficient light bulbs. And they have reported a budget for your department for next year that would cut funding for energy efficiency programs. The same is true for investments in research to develop the solar, wind, and other clean energy technologies of the future. Secretary Moniz, within your department there's a division called ARPA-E, which invests in advanced energy research projects. It's widely praised by the scientific and research community for finding breakthrough technology. Yet this year, the House Appropriations Committee voted to slash its budget by over 80%. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
In this committee, I often hear Republican members argue against U.S. efforts to do anything about reducing emissions because our nation would be at a competitive disadvantage. And they say we need a global approach. But then the House Appropriations Committee votes to defund the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the international body charged with negotiating an international climate treaty. Last Congress, House Republicans also voted to defund our efforts, government's lead, not only our international efforts, but to defund our government's lead climate negotiator. Add it all up, what do you have? House Republicans have voted against climate change legislation. They have voted against climate regulation. They have voted against climate research and development. And they voted against international climate efforts. It's an appalling record. And it's why my question to them is, what's your plan? It's easy to criticize other people's solutions, but if all you do is criticize, you're either a climate denier because you don't think anything needs to be done, the science doesn't warrant it, it's not happening, or they're ignoring the warning of scientists. Secretary Moniz told us that we have a very narrow window to act. We should be starting to act now. And that's why we need to stop ignoring the scientists and start listening to them, Mr. Chairman. So tell us what your plan is. Don't just criticize, because we're facing a serious problem, not for the future, but right now with extreme weather events.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that it's important that as we conduct oversight of agency actions on climate change and energy that we also reflect on the statutory frameworks of the agencies implementing such policy. And as an example point that I'd like to make is, as we reflect back on DOE's energy coordination role, it was developed, frankly, back at the time of energy constraints, way back in the 1970s. I think you would agree, Dr. Moniz, that we're currently in a new era of North American energy abundance, where I believe, and I think the stats will show that as well, that we can actually be energy independent for North America by using all of our resources that are available. And I would like you to comment on that as part of the record.
And certainly, Mr. Chairman, the President and I are both very supportive of this all of the above energy strategy within a world where we are working to reduce CO2 emissions.
Now, I know on page 10 of the President's Climate Action Plan on the natural gas bullet, it says it refers to natural gas as a bridge fuel. And is it the policy of DOE to consider natural gas as a bridge fuel?
Well, our policy is to do what we can to support clean, safe production of natural gas, and I might add also of so-called unconventional oil.
So as we look at what you may be doing as an agency to approve or consider export applications for LNG, is a bridge fuel, is that part of the discussion or the debate?
No, sir, that's not been part of the discussion to date. I mean, our approach to the LNG exports is, by law, to approve them unless we rule an application as not in the public interest. Public interest determination has many facets. We have just given, as you know, another 2 applications, conditional approvals recently. I should emphasize that the final approval will require the environmental review through FERC and then coming back to the Department of Energy.
I just know, as I look at the situation, particularly as we try to become North American energy independent, the new discoveries and fields that we've been able to find of natural gas are an exciting, positive change. We look at the advent of the manufacture of vehicles, passenger vehicles, perhaps using natural gas. We look at some of the large fleets by some of our businesses, whether they be UPS or AT&T and others, being able to convert those vehicles to natural gas. We look at, I have a major manufacturer in my district, Eaton, which is looking at natural gas trucks for their fleet. We even look at locomotives, our railroads, looking at perhaps a very positive transition from diesel to natural gas, and the work of I know Caterpillar and General Electric at producing those and seeing if in fact it will have a very positive impact on our economy and to real change. Ms. McCarthy, does EPA consider natural gas abundance as a bridge fuel?
EPA views natural gas abundance as a positive for air quality, as an opportunity for us domestically to be safe and secure in our energy supplies. Our responsibility is to ensure that that's done as safely and responsibly as we can, working with the industry.
You know, one of the concerns that I hear is, particularly as I talk to the railroad folks, and they're looking at this potential change, conversion to natural gas, is that they're concerned that as they look at purchasing these, if in fact they work, that the regulations may change, thus impacting the, quote, payback period as it relates to is EPA considering new regulations to do that?
Any regulations that EPA would consider are going to be thoughtfully proposed and commented on. Right now, sir, I think it's safe to say that EPA is investing very heavily in opportunities to understand the sector, to gather data, to work with the industry in a collaborative way. We see this as a very positive collaboration moving forward. We see this as a significant opportunity to reduce air pollutants and to move forward in a safe and effective domestic supply. And so I'm very encouraged about the relationship we're building with the gas industry, the rules we've already put out. I see no reason for concern that situation is going to change and people won't be able to rely on this as a cleaner fuel moving forward.
Thank you. I know my time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time,
may I just add a footnote with your permission?
Yes, sir.
I just want to say to Chairman Upton, I would add to your list marine applications and also in fracking, replacing diesels with natural gas engines there as well, less oil use and better air quality.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to explore two things in my 5 minutes. First is the confidence that you have that climate change is taking place, is a significant threat, and is caused by a large degree by human activities. And secondly, if actions taken to combat climate change will harm or benefit the economy. So first, Secretary Moniz, would you address the first question? How confident are you that climate change is taking place? that it's a significant threat, and that it's caused to a large degree by human activity?
Well, again, first of all, of course, the scientific community overwhelmingly endorses those statements, and I personally do. As I've said in a previous hearing before this committee, I think my confidence in those statements does not rely just on the results of some very complicated computer models, but some very simple arithmetic in terms of what's been known for a long time about the strength of CO2, are emitting is of a scale that within decades we would reach areas such as doubling pre-industrial emissions, which have always been viewed as being highly, highly risky.
Thank you. Administrator McCarthy, I'd like to address my second question to you in this form. How have higher standards such as those as fuel efficiency helped drive innovation and create jobs?
Well, we have been working with the auto industry in particular over the past few years to understand what they need to have certainty moving forward on air quality standards, on fuel efficiency, on greenhouse gas standards. We have worked together, and as a result of our rules, we have been able to support the industry in a robust sort of reemergence of that industry, both domestically and internationally. We're proud of the work we've done together. We're delivering fuel-efficient vehicles for consumers in the way they want them. We're saving them money. We're reducing greenhouse gases. And we believe we're part of the auto industry's effort to gain a competitive advantage that's to a great advantage for jobs and economy in this country.
So you believe Detroit has become more competitive with these higher fuel standards, thereby creating more jobs?
We know that certainty is important moving forward. We have provided this industry a path forward till 2025. That gives them an opportunity to do research, to develop new technologies, and to have a solid footing moving forward.
Thank you.
If I may just add,
Sure.
Sir, on the auto side, I think it's actually even a bigger story going back to when the auto industry in this country looked like it was on its last legs. A whole combination of issues, from support for GM and Chrysler, assuming they had proper restructuring for the future, to loan guarantees for Ford and Nissan. Nissan built a plant in Tennessee because of that loan guarantee, to preparing for the future with the electric vehicle markets and the great success story of Tesla. We could talk about Fisker, which we all know is a different issue today, but overall this portfolio has taken us to an incredibly vibrant auto industry that's growing faster than the Chinese auto industry.
Are there any other technologies or items that energy efficiency or work toward renewable energy has created jobs that you'd like to point to?
Oh, certainly. We could go through lots and lots of those stories. First of all, on the autos, Tesla is a story of 3,000 jobs in California. That's way above even their business plan. In terms of, take the solar PV business, and I'll go back to our loan guarantee program. When there was no debt financing available, those loans supported the first 6 utility-scale PV projects in this country. There have subsequently been 10 with pure private financing. That's jobs all the way from the manufacturing, the supply chain, to the installation and operation.
Well, do you see grid modernization playing a role in helping reduce climate change and also in creating jobs?
Grid modernization is a very, very high priority. It has multiple benefits. One would be the integration of renewables into the system. A second is that it can provide, with intelligence embedded in the grid, it can provide new consumer services and higher efficiency, lower bills. And finally, it will be needed to, as the example I gave in New Jersey, to provide resilience against the extreme weather events that we are seeing more and more of.
Well, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our 2 witnesses and give you the red badge of courage for showing up. We invited 13 agencies, and I don't know if y'all drew straws and got the long straws or whatever, but You two are here, and we're glad you're here. We didn't hear from the Department of Agriculture, Defense, HHS, Interior, State Department, Transportation, Export and Import Bank, NASA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Science and Technology Policy, or U.S. Agency for International Development. For some reason they couldn't make it, but you two are, and y'all been here before, and we're glad y'all are both here. Each of you and the other 11 agencies got a letter dated August the 6th, 2013, asking you to attend, and it asked you to answer 9 questions. Now, when Mr. Waxman was speaking in his Q&A, he said that the Obama administration has spent about $60 billion on climate change. The number I had was $70 billion, but we'll go with Mr. Waxman's $60 billion number. And this is really an effort to let the Obama administration put their best foot forward. So we asked 9 questions, and I asked the staff if your agencies had answered these questions, and I'm told that they'd not. So I'm going to read them into the record and then give each of you briefly a chance to see if you can get us these answers. The first question that we asked your agency was to describe the climate change-related research and technology programs that you're actively engaged in, including programs or activities undertaken with other federal agencies. We didn't get an answer to that. We asked you to describe the climate change adaptation, mitigation, or sustainability-related activities engaged in, including activities undertaken with other federal agencies. We didn't get an answer to that. We asked you to identify all the climate change-related interagency task forces, advisory committees, working groups, and initiatives in which your agency is currently participating in or has participated in since January of 2005. Didn't get an answer to that. We ask you to identify all climate change or clean energy-related funding, grants, or financial assistance programs which your agency is currently participating or has participated in, and the amount of climate change or clean energy-related funding, grants, and financial assistance distributed by your agencies since January of 2005. Didn't get an answer to that. We ask you to identify all the climate change-related regulations or guidance documents, including regulations or standards to reduce greenhouse gas emissions issued or proposed by your agency since January 2005 or under development. Didn't get an answer to that. We ask you to identify all the climate change-related international negotiations, agreements, partnerships, working groups, or initiatives in which you currently or have previously participated since January 2005. Didn't get an answer to that. Provide the approximate amount of annual agency funding attributed to climate change activities for the fiscal years 2005 through 2012. Didn't get an answer to that. Describe the actions that your agency has undertaken to respond to the executive order by the President, 13514, including the approximate cost, personnel, and other resources dedicated by your agency to implement that executive order. Didn't get an answer to that, Mr. Chairman. And last but not least, to provide a list of each sub-agency, division, and/or program office within your agency that is currently engaged in climate change-related activities, and to provide an estimate of the approximate number of your agency employees and/or contractors engaged part-time or full-time in climate change-related activities. Guess what? Didn't get an answer to that. Now, Mr. Waxman has been asking this committee and the subcommittee to hold hearings on Mr. President Obama's climate change efforts all year long. We asked 9 questions. We didn't get one straight answer. Are you trying to hide something? Are you embarrassed by it? Or you just don't care to respond to the Congress?
Well, I'll answer first, at least, Mr. Barton. Thank you. Look, I am very happy to come and discuss any and all of those questions. I'll address a few of them now, if you'd like. Certainly for the Department of Energy, for example, the question on regulations instead of standards, that's clear. It's efficiency standards is what we do in this regard. In terms of the programs, as I said earlier, I would say, well, our last budget, FY13, enacted the question is ambiguous, but if we take all of the programs that help address climate change, even if they have other objectives like efficiency, then that count would come to about 5.4 billion. But as I say, there's multiple objectives. There's fuel diversity, nuclear energy, fossil energy, etc.
The time has expired, and
Okay.
I think, Mr. Secretary, we do appreciate your making an effort to answer, but I do hope that you all would get with your staffs and try to respond to us, because, as it was indicated, we asked these questions
We'll do
some
that,
time ago, and we would appreciate you all responding to that.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, the point I'm trying to make is we're trying to have a good faith effort here to have a real dialogue, but in order to have the dialogue, we have to have the facts, and we're being stonewalled, which means the American people is being stonewalled. These are not complicated questions, and they're not trick questions. If the Obama administration has this great climate change action plan, every one of these questions should be able to be answered in detail and in glowing terms. So I would hope that you two representatives of the Obama administration, first of all, both of you are good people, you're smart, you've got integrity, you've worked with this committee. Get us the straight facts, and then we'll have a debate with the other
Gentlemen,
side,
yield.
folks, over what those facts mean.
Mr. Barton, will you yield to me just to correct
If I
a
have
statement?
time, I'll be happy to yield.
Well, you quoted me as saying the $60 billion has been spent, but my statement was that we proposed $60 billion to be spent under our legislation. Secondly, it's unprecedented to have two cabinet-level officials who have the primary burden of dealing with the climate change issue come before a subcommittee. I hardly call that stonewalling.
Actually, CRS said $70 billion over the last 4 years, but
Well, we're talking about different. He quoted me as saying $60 billion. I wasn't saying it's 60 instead of 70. My statement about $60 billion was what we proposed to spend in the cap and trade bill.
this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Dingle, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. Administrator McCarthy, welcome back to the committee, and congratulations on your new position as EPA Administrator. We wish you good luck as you take on this new position. And also, Mr. Secretary, we welcome you to the committee. Gentlemen and ladies, these questions will be yes or no, and I will request then that you give us some additional information as a response after the response has been made. So for both of our witnesses, does EPA or the Department of Energy see a future for coal as a viable energy source in light of the impending greenhouse gas regulations? Please answer yes or no, and then submit additional information for the record.
Yes, Congressman.
And I agree with yes.
Now, Administrator McCarthy, I understand that there will be a different proposal for modified sources, i.e. units that have been updated, and also for existing sources that have not been modified. Can you tell me if EPA is reaching out to all stakeholders concerned about both components of the greenhouse gas rule? Please answer yes or no.
To the best ability we can, yes, we are.
Would you please also, Madam Administrator, submit more information for the record? Now, is EPA thinking about a unit-by-unit compliance goal for the existing and modified source carbon standards? Please answer yes or no.
We are thinking about that and a number of other different flexible strategies.
Would you submit such additional comments for the record as you deem appropriate?
Yes, sir.
Now, the debate about climate change is not just about air, but it's also about water. I am sure that both you and the Secretary understand this. Administrator McCarthy, you may know that you do well know that the Great Lakes contain 20% of the world's fresh water. Luckily, our water levels are up slightly this year after years of inadequate ice cover on the lakes and too little precipitation, rain and snow. Lower lake levels affect not only shipping and boating and recreation, but also make it easier for algae blooms to form, endangered fish habitats, and threatened drinking water sources, as well as industrial and cooling water intakes. Madam Administrator, do you believe that the President's Climate Action Plan provides the direction for EPA to deal with the unique problems of the Great Lakes? Please answer yes or no.
Yes.
Will EPA, under your leadership, continue to work with other federal and state agencies to address climate-related problems on the Great Lakes? Yes or no?
Yes.
In dealing with water quality, do you believe that EPA has adequate clarification of its jurisdiction under the Clean Air Act, under the Clean Water Act, to ensure protection of water sources? Please answer yes or no.
Not as yet, but we are certainly working on that.
I want you to give us some additional response on that, because that is a matter of deep concern, I think, to you, and it is to me, too. Now, Madam Administrator, as these problems on the Great Lakes become more frequent, do you believe EPA will need further clarification of its Clean Water Act jurisdiction? Please answer yes or no.
Yes, I do.
And I believe you're finding, Madam Administrator, that the actions taken by the Congress to foreclose you and EPA from giving us additional work in terms of rules and regulations clarifying the Supreme Court decision are extremely unhealthy. Am I correct? Yes or no?
We find them very difficult.
Now, I'm sure you have seen a recent map published in the National Geographic showing what would happen if all the world's ice were to melt. While this is a somewhat drastic scenario, it shows almost all of Florida and all of New Jersey submerged. It was not the map, however, that intrigued me most. The map showed little or no effect on the Great Lakes. Do you believe that EPA, along with other federal agencies, have the tools necessary to predict what effects climate change might have on the Great Lakes Basin and the region in which they exist? Please answer yes or no.
Yes.
Would you submit additional information for the record as you deem it appropriate?
I will.
Now, I would like to have a submission from you, Mr. Secretary, about what it is you are going to do about potential shortages and whether we have shortages coming on electric power because of the actions that are going to have to be taken with regard to global warming and matters of that kind, and how that is going to affect our future in terms of the reliability and availability of electric power. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, if you would submit that for the record, please.
And I'll just note, sir, that we have a report of vulnerabilities of the energy infrastructure that will answer many of your questions. I might just add one factoid, that there are projections that in an unconstrained world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we could see about a 2-foot drop in the level of the Great Lakes in this century, which would, of course, be very, very disruptive.
Industry is going to make a large number of retirements of plants because of...
Gentleman's time has expired.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. In the argument about whether or not climate change is taking place, I know one thing by the argument that Mr. Barton had with the gentleman from California, something that is taking place, and taxing the hardworking people of this country is taking place. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your opening statement when you set out. And it wasn't an estimate on your part. It's from the Congressional Research Service. They usually are pretty accurate. That climate change funding for climate science, technology, international assistance, and adoption for approximately $70 billion for the period 2008 to 2012. And Mr. Barton, you got better answers. I counted, I think, 12 or 15 of those people that didn't give you any answer at all. By no answer, you got a better answer than I received from Mrs. McCarthy about a year ago in the Science Committee. You remember coming before a committee there. And I may have asked you a question you didn't like, and your answer was, I'm not in the job of creating jobs. I'm not in the business of creating jobs. That's out of the record itself. And I left word there for you to, if you wanted to apologize to the millions of people that were unemployed and many of them hungry. And I've never seen that apology to this day. Actually, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit more of my questions in writing. I have more than the 5 minutes allows me to make here. But now spending is taking place at $20 billion per year, and we can figure that up however we want to. And I yield back the time. I thank both of the witnesses for appearing.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Moniz, if we are going to reduce our carbon pollution, we need to deploy more clean energy and boost energy efficiency. Yesterday, the Department of Energy released its report showing that wind and solar power, LED lighting, and electric vehicles are growing rapidly in this country as a result of well-designed federal and state incentives and investments in research and development. That being said, the report finds that as a result of these measures, and I quote, the historic shift to a cleaner, more domestic and more secure energy future is not some faraway goal. We are living it, and it is gaining force, end quote. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter this report into the record, Mr. Chair. We may?
Without objection.
Thank you. The report contained a particularly striking graph about the cost and deployment of wind energy in the United States. Wind capacity has skyrocketed in our country, and I believe the committee has that graph, and if we are posting it on the screen. Thank you. Secretary Moniz, what has been the key to wind power's success? As you see, we have the graph itself on the display screen.
Well, I think the story is, as I alluded to earlier, it's actually the same story that we saw decades ago with unconventional natural gas. We had investment from the federal government, we had public-private partnerships, and we had kind of a time-limited, well-crafted incentive that has these things taking off. We're seeing the same thing now with wind. As we can see, the deployment is very, very striking, and of course the costs, certainly in good wind areas, are quite competitive with other sources. The report has similar graphs, same kind of message with photovoltaics. Solar energy, it is not fully appreciated how competitive solar is already in the right conditions, which is typical for this stage of a technology penetrating the market. So is the response for solar as strong as this wind? Perhaps stronger. Super. What can we do? And also, if I may add, in LEDs, it's totally incredible. It's gone from, 50,000 to 20 million deployed in the country in a very short time, and the cost has gone from $50 to $15, and the lifetime savings from one LED is over $100. Thank you. What can we do to ensure that today's R&D is utilized fully into emerging energy technologies so that we can achieve these same levels of success? Well, first of all, we need to, as I said earlier, we need a sustained commitment to maintain the research, development, demonstration, and deployment push. That's absolutely required. And these will be market competitive technologies, again, sooner rather than later. The other thing is, of course, we'd like to capture the full value of these developments. And that involves other things that we are doing, such as, for example, the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership to really help establish the cutting-edge manufacturing capacity and training in this country. Mm-hmm. Energy efficiency is a key part of the President's Climate Action Plan. Energy efficiency is one of the cheapest and most cost-effective ways to reduce carbon pollution while saving consumers money.
and it's a big part of the Department of Energy's responsibilities under the President's plan. Mr. Secretary, the President's plan calls for new energy efficiency standards for appliances and equipment. Why are energy efficiency standards a good way to reduce carbon pollution?
These standards apply to reducing all of our emissions, carbon emissions as well as conventional pollutants, by reducing the energy needs quite substantially. But I really want to emphasize, all of our rules have a cost-benefit test, and they also save money for consumers. The upfront marginal increases are overwhelmed by the energy savings at the consumer level.
Well, some believe that taking action to address climate change will kill jobs and cost consumers money. Is that an accurate description of these energy efficiency standards?
No, we believe that they create jobs, for one thing, by saving money in the economy that can be devoted to other purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition, it gives us products that we can sell globally.
Mm-hmm. See that my time is up, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, welcome. It's glad to have both of you here today. Secretary Moniz, any serious plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions substantially must have a strong nuclear component. Do you agree with that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Mr. Chairman?
Nuclear power is critical in, obviously, having a greenhouse gas plant.
Yeah, we are supporting nuclear power, yes.
Do you consider nuclear programs to be a critical part of this administration's plan?
Yes, it's all the above, and nuclear is strongly there.
So you probably were interested in following the last licensing case before the NRC, and the only person who voted against licensing, that was the then chairman, Yasko, who was appointed by this president. So the concern is the conflicting signals we're seeing. You've got the presidential appointed chairman of the NRC casting the only no vote for licensing a new nuclear power plant in this country. And so that leads to the other questions. Under this administration, how many nuclear reactors have closed down?
I believe there are 5.
Yeah, it's about 6. We've got one in New Jersey, Wisconsin, California, Florida, and Vermont.
And 5 being built.
Right, without the vote to license by the chairman of the NRC, who was appointed by the president. So I'll give you that point, but you have to give me a point on jobs, that a lot of jobs have been lost by the shutdown of these nuclear facilities. Under the President's Climate Action Plan, EPA is expected to propose a rule later this week setting greenhouse gas standards for new power plants that will require CCS technologies for any new coal plant built in the U.S. This is effectively, as many of us fear, and Administrator McCarthy knows where I stand on this, a ban on new coal-fired power plants. Do you believe, as the Secretary of Energy, that it's defensible for the EPA to impose regulations that essentially ban the building of new coal-fired power plants in this country?
Well, I certainly am not going to comment on the ongoing.
But from an energy position of an energy position of the base load demand of the requirements of this country and low-cost power, obviously removing coal-fired power plants from the fleet will raise costs.
Again, our job, the Department of Energy, is to
support the production of low-cost energy for our consumers and our manufacturers and the like.
For coal in a low-carbon world, and I might add, there's lots of activity already.
Well, we're going to keep following on that course of questions. Is the DOE aware of any U.S. commercial-scale power generation plant using coal as a fuel that captures, transports, and permanently stores carbon dioxide?
Well, as you know, there have been a number of demonstrations. There's a commercial
That's not
plant.
The question is there one today?
Commercial plant, 75% complete in Mississippi.
But
also,
it's not generating and not storing.
But if I may add, it's not a power plant, but I think we should not ignore that.
That's another good point.
After 12 years, we have had the Great Plains Weyburn project. 20 million tons have been used for EOR, and it's running on a commercial basis.
The point is, CCS takes billions of dollars. There's no commercially available technology to do it. It's not being conducted right now. and I'm going to turn to the administrator, who's a friend, but for these new rules to be promulgated, it is a signal that we're not going to build new coal-fired power plants until there is at least a demonstrated ability to have this technology. And the concern is the costs are going to be great. Administrator McCarthy, has EPA ever established a new source performance standard for an emission source on the basis of technology that has not been commercially proven by operation at commercial scale?
We have in the past, for example, our use of scrubbers was seen as an innovative but available.
But it was commercially available at that time.
It was.
That's the whole difference between the clean air debate and the greenhouse gas debate. Is in the clean air debate, technology was available. In the greenhouse gas debate, it's not available. That is really the number one concern that we have. Do you want to?
No.
Do you agree with that?
Congressman, the rule has yet to be issued, but I will say that this is an issue that was heavily discussed. That's the reason why we're re-proposing. We'll have a full debate about this when the rule goes out. But I would indicate to you that this rule is not about existing facilities. It is about the future plants that are being constructed, and there are 4 plants now being constructed that are planning on and designing in CCS at levels that would beat anything that we had proposed in our earlier proposal.
And I hope you're right, and I hope it's successful. My point will be it'll be costly. I'm going to end on this, Chairman. And I think you have litigation issues that are unknown. I mean, the state of Illinois is primed for this. As you know, Secretary, you're doing your research there. There's other issues just than being able to, get this down in deep sequestration aquifer. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. McCarthy, will you provide us a list of those 4 plants you just referred to?
Certainly.
Thank you. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Greene, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And like my colleagues, I'd like to welcome Administrator McCarthy and Secretary Moniz, and thank you both for appearing today and look forward to our discussion, and I've enjoyed it so far. Mr. McCarthy, I've been concerned in the past that EPA has not taken DOE's concern about reliability seriously when developing utility rules. Can you commit to giving deference to DOE on grid reliability when drafting a rule for existing power plants? Is that part of the consideration with EPA?
We have worked hand in hand in developing this proposal, and we certainly will in the evaluation of comments and moving any rule forward.
Okay. And I see the Secretary shaking his head, too. So I'm glad you're all working together, because even though we want as clean air as we can, we still want to be able to turn on the lights.
Yes.
And particularly in Texas, have our air conditioning in the summer. I generally support the research and international efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions that the administration is undertaking. When it comes to regulating carbon from our industrial sources, I do see that Congress should move past its gridlock and develop a regulatory plan instead of the EPA. It needs to be, I think Congress ought to do our job, and particularly after the Supreme Court said the EPA already has the current authority. But until Congress starts to legislate again, we can't sit here and just complain about the EPA for doing what the Supreme Court said it has the authority. Climate change is real and something that Congress should act on. Secretary Moniz, where are we with the CCS technology? I know that the plant in Mississippi may be up and running in the next year, but even that's not guaranteed. When do you reasonably expect CCS to become technologically and economically feasible?
Well, I think the carbon capture, and we should talk about carbon capture and sequestration. Certainly carbon capture, whether it be for combustion plants or for gasification plants, is demonstrated technology. We continue to invest in new technologies that will further reduce cost, but those are used technologies in various places. For example, well, certainly in the petrochemical industry, in the former case, Great Plains plant in the second place, and on sequestration side, on storage side, as I said earlier, this one plant, this one field in Weyburn for enhanced oil recovery has already stored 20 million tons, and largely in Texas, actually, we are using 60 megatons a year for producing 300,000 barrels of oil. So this is a going concern. So the components are all there.
Well, and I think some of our concern is that we don't want the requirements to get past what either the technology or what you can capitalize to be able to deal with it. And so there needs to be coordination there. If that technology is there, and there are examples of it. But is the plant up in Mississippi? Do we have a timeline on when they're going to actually be up and running?
I believe they're operating in 2014 or 2015. It's quite close. It's a gasification plant again, and again the CO2 will go to enhanced oil recovery in local fields.
Well, and there's been success in the Midland area, the Permian Basin for enhanced oil recovery, and we even have a pipeline from Mississippi to the Gulf Coast to use it. So there are examples.
It's on average. On average, it's been in Texas. It's been about a half a ton stored per barrel of oil produced.
Okay, I appreciate it because it is a beneficial use. We can use it for things to enhance recovery. I mean, you testified that in developing the GHG regulations for existing power plants, you engaged in the outreach to a broad group of stakeholders with expertise who can inform the development of proposed standards, regulation, guidelines, which you expect to issue in June of 2014. You also said that for us to be successful, the policy we develop have to promote economic growth. Some people say that any policy to address climate change is only going to do harm to our economy. To what degree will utilities play a role in developing these regulations? Is there a formal process already scheduled that they participate in?
EPA has already engaged in a number of utility and energy-related forums talking about this issue, and we will engage with the utility every step of the way. It is my concerted belief, and I think you will see this as we talk to states, that they're taking numerous actions already that are reducing greenhouse gases. There are so many states that already have renewable fuel standards, energy efficiency standards. They're working with their mayors to make their cities more efficient. There are ways in which we can recognize and understand how best we can shape these plans that states need to develop that will be beneficial to them on an economic perspective and beneficial to the U.S. and the world to reduce the threat of climate change.
And these power plants, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over time, but these power companies are actually part of that process.
Well, very much so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing, and Administrator McCarthy and Secretary Moniz, appreciate you all being here. We're talking about climate change policies, and of course, a lot of this comes in the context of economic policy, how these policies have an impact on families, how they have an impact on the economy. We hear all the time from small businesses I meet with, and I know talking to my colleagues the same thing. Some of the biggest impediments they have to creating jobs right now are policies coming out of Washington, and frankly, Administrator McCarthy, the policies coming out of EPA seem to be at the top of that list. A lot of the threats coming out of EPA, and I know you're new to the current job you have, but you've been at the EPA in different roles throughout these years, and I don't know if y'all recognize those impacts. We've talked about them before in our committee hearings, but when you look at the climate policies that you're proposing, I want to read a comment from you recently and get your take on it. I think the administrator said this recently. Essentially, this is a quote, essentially the President said that it is time to act. He said he wasn't going to wait for Congress, but that he had administrative authorities and that it was time to start utilizing those more effectively in a more concerted way. And so, Administrator McCarthy, when you talk about the President's task to you to act regardless of what Congress does, it causes a big concern not only to members of Congress, but to people across the country who believe in a democratic process where Republicans and Democrats work together, and Congress is the body that's supposed to shape law, and then the President, through his secretaries, including you, are the ones who are supposed to administer the policies that Congress passed. And so when you're echoing the President who says, you know what, I don't care if Congress didn't do it, it's time to act anyway, I hope you understand the chilling effect it sends across the country, and I'd like to get your interpretation of what you think the President means and what you think the authority you have to act is, even if Congress chooses not to go down the path you want to.
I think that, let me rephrase the issue in a way that hopefully is a bit more positive. I think the President
Because it's not positive when I hear those comments.
I think the President has reached out and indicated that congressional action would be something that he would want to engage in and that he would welcome. I think what he's also told us to do is look at the laws that Congress has already enacted through their own public democratic process, and what have they told the agencies that their responsibility is and their authority is. We are not doing anything at EPA or in the climate plan that goes outside the boundaries of what Congress has said is our mission and our authority.
Well, and I would hope you would keep that in mind as you develop policies, because we are concerned about some of the things that you're doing in terms of them going against wishes of Congress. And there have been the cap and trade bill got defeated when there was a supermajority in the Senate. So clearly Congress spoke that that's not something that we wanted. Just a few weeks ago, we in the House voted, the vote was 237 to 176 to reject a carbon tax. An actual vote on the House floor to reject a carbon tax, and it passed overwhelmingly with Democrats voting with Republicans. And in fact, Barbara Boxer was recently quoted saying, quote, "We don't have the votes for carbon tax or carbon fee." I would hope you would take all of that into consideration when you're looking at climate change policies. Not only did we say we don't want it, we voted to reject a carbon tax. And so you need to take that into consideration. That's not an authority you have. And in fact, Congress has now said that is something that you don't have an authority. We reject that. I want to also bring up, when you look at the impacts of these kind of policies, how they're working in other countries. And again, it has a real impact on our economy when some of these rules are proposed, but some of these other countries across the globe have already tried to go down this road in terms of climate change policy that you're looking at. There was just a revolt in Australia in their government, a complete upheaval because of their carbon tax. In fact, there's a movement with this new government to repeal the carbon tax. Read from the Telegraph just a few weeks ago. Brussels fears European industrial massacre sparked by energy costs. The Business Report. Merkel warns EU against tough carbon targets. Financial Times. European utilities warn EU over energy risks. Special Online. Germany's energy poverty, how electricity becomes a luxury good. It goes on and on. In the UK Express, £3,000 a year bills on the way as energy prices rise again. The Telegraph, romantic Germany risks economic decline as green dreams spoils. I hope you understand, the countries that have tried this, it's failing miserably. They're having revolts in those countries. So Congress has acted. Congress has sent a message to you. I would hope you would respect those messages that have been sent, not just here in Congress, but look at what's happened and where they've actually gone down this road in other countries, and they're seeing dramatic declines in their economy, dramatic increases in energy costs that hurts real families. These are the concerns we have as you're looking at climate policy in your agency. Recognize the will of the people here in this country. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Will Ms. Capps yield to me for 30 seconds?
Yes, I will.
I just want to point out that there's no reason you should be mindful of proposals that even pass the House if they're not law. You've got to be mindful of what the laws are. And what you have to do is enforce the laws. So this argument, you should pay attention to what Republicans were able to pass through the House, is not a law. Thank you for yielding to me.
Thank you. Thank you also from me, Administrator McCarthy and Secretary Moniz, for appearing today and for your testimony. Given the immediate and long-term threats posed by climate change, I'm very encouraged that we're finally having a formal discussion on this pressing issue. With Congress in action, the President's Climate Action Plan is a welcome step forward, and we need to debate it because we need to cut carbon pollution. We need to help prepare for the impacts of climate change. Last February, I led a letter to the President signed by 40 of my colleagues urging him to create a panel to help local communities to prepare for climate change impacts. One of our key recommendations in this letter was to fully evaluate the budgetary impacts of this problem. Climate change is already costing the federal government tens of billions of dollars in disaster assistance, right? Some of this, by investing some of this money up front in resiliency measures, we could minimize these costly impacts down the road, and we could create jobs doing that implementation. So I was pleased to see the President included a similar task force on preparedness in his climate action plan. Administrator McCarthy, can you discuss what the task force will be working on and to what extent it will be examining this budgetary impact? For example, will you be issuing findings comparing the long-term costs of inaction to those of building a more resilient infrastructure?
Thank you for the question. As you recognize, the President's Climate Action Plan focused just as heavily on the adaptation question as it did on the mitigation issues in the international component. I think he did that recognizing the extreme concern that communities are facing now and the public health impacts associated with not recognizing that the climate is changing, in preparing for that, in making our communities more resilient in a changing climate. He established a task force to look at these issues. We are going to be working with every state and community. There is support already that's been recently issued by the Department of the Interior to look at resiliency projects, $100 million as a result of the climate action plan, moving this forward. We all have, each agency, developed climate action plans. We're participating on both the national forums as well as developing our own task forces to begin to work with communities more effectively, to integrate what we know about a changing climate into the work that we do. There is a great deal of work ongoing. It's been nurtured over the past few years, but it certainly has been given a boost in the action plan, and we'll move this forward.
Thank you.
Could I just, may I just?
Well, okay, but I have a question for you, too. Let me ask the question, and then maybe you can weave that in. DOE currently focuses heavily on more mature technologies like solar and wind. While I support these efforts, of course, I want to make sure we're not neglecting some other promising renewable technologies. For example, there are several companies, including EcoMerit in my district, which are developing exciting new technologies to reliably harness energy from ocean waves, tides, and currents. In fact, the EcoMerit was recently awarded a $500,000 DOE grant to help develop its wave energy technology. This only scratches the surface, however, of public and private investments that's needed. So, Secretary, I was going to ask you, and you can respond any way you want to, what does the President's Climate Action Plan do to expand the development of marine and hydrokinetic energy technologies?
Thank you. If I may just add a footnote to the earlier question, that in addition to the task force, there's also been a specific Sandy task force led by HUD. The work that I described earlier on the microgrid comes under that umbrella, and that will be translatable to other parts of the country. Absolutely. Finally, under FEMA, we also have responsibilities for DOE, it's for energy infrastructure, other agencies for other parts of our national infrastructure. On the second, on your question to me, it's very important that we not forget what are sometimes called the forgotten renewables, and that includes hydrokinetic, waves, tides, small hydro, advanced geothermal, and we are looking to increase our emphasis on those as we go forward.
Thank you. If I could follow up, I'd love to have a written response on some of the ways that you want to do that I could take back to some promising industries in my local district that would love some support like the one that was given to EcoMerit in terms of energy technology.
Gentlelady's time's expired. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Moniz, you've recently taken over leadership at DOE, and you understand the role of DOE in establishing and coordinating national energy policy. Can you tell us whether DOE is going to have an active role going forward in ensuring that the climate policies pursued by other federal agencies do not negatively affect the affordability and availability of energy?
Thank you for the question. The principal way in which we will be doing that over these next, say, 3 years is the so-called quadrennial energy review process. that will be convened out of the Executive Office of the President, but the Department of Energy will be establishing the Secretariat and the analytical underpinning. So that will involve the entire administration. So that will be our principal role there. And I can also assure you, as I have in previous testimony here, that we view our job in technology development as being to innovate, to keep lowering the costs of energy for our consumers and our industry.
So you will review climate policies, regulatory initiatives of EPA that have the potential to negatively affect the affordability and reliability of energy?
Well, for processes, and Ms. McCarthy can answer, I mean, of course, we have review processes. What we will do in this context is help provide the threads, some of the analytics, to bring together all the agencies to discuss energy policy broadly, environment, security, economy.
Administrator McCarthy, I want to understand, with all the climate change related programs that your agency pursues, such as research, technology development, grants, education, and outreach, does your agency determine at the outset what those programs are supposed to accomplish and then go back and evaluate whether they actually did accomplish what they set out to do?
We keep quite close tracking, and I would just add that many of the programs that we run are programs that Congress has specifically directed us to run and at specific funding levels.
Now, does EPA make information about what these programs have actually achieved available to the public?
Very much so. We're quite.
Can you identify for us what or where that information is available?
I can certainly provide that to you.
Now, EPA has been implementing climate policies for a number of years. Have you evaluated what that work has actually accomplished in terms of meaningfully addressing climate risk? And could you share that with the committee?
We certainly take a look at work that we do to understand what kind of greenhouse gas reductions might have been reduced. But as we all know, reducing climate risk is a global effort. The U.S. is participating in that effort as rigorously as we can.
Now, Ms. McCarthy, does EPA coordinate with other agencies when it evaluates the impact of its regulatory action relating to the power sector?
Very much so. In every regulatory process, all agencies participate in the interagency review. Part of that is to look at the cost and benefit analysis that EPA produces and to comment on both of those.
So, for example, have you consulted with the Department of Health and Human Services about the impact of energy poverty or higher energy prices on health or the ability to respond to extreme weather events?
Well, what we have done is to ensure that we do a complete analysis to the extent that it's available to us and appropriate on what the economic consequences are of our rulemaking, and we take great pains to make sure that we do not threaten reliability, nor do we put out rules that will significantly increase cost to consumers.
One other question, Administrator McCarthy. The President's Climate Action Plan says on page 10 that, quote, curbing emissions of methane is critical to our overall effort to address climate change, end quote. And it refers to an interagency methane strategy group that is identifying technologies and best practices for reducing methane emissions. I should also note that EPA's website indicates that we can cut methane significantly by reducing reliance on landfilling and increasing use of modern waste energy facilities, like the one in my district, the Lancaster County Solid Waste Management Authority's facility. Will you recommend to the Interagency Methane Strategy Group, or may I request that you recommend the importance of focusing on ways to increase the United States use of waste energy for managing non-recyclable waste?
Yeah, we will raise that issue, but I think if you see the tone and tenor of the President's remarks in the Climate Action Plan, it is an effort to understand where methane is being generated, how effectively to work with the industry on strategies that will reduce that methane and recapture it, because it becomes a significant financial opportunity. Those are the kinds of things we certainly want to capitalize on.
If I may add, the $8 billion loan guarantee program that we will be issuing would include MSW technologies as a possibility.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator McCarthy, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Secretary Moniz, I just want to say your recent visit to Pittsburgh was appreciated and well received by all of us in attendance, and we hope to have you back there soon. Well, your visit is very timely today because many of us are eagerly awaiting the first rule regulating carbon pollution from power plants, the single biggest emitter of carbon in the United States. And though I think the legislation to address climate change through a cap-and-trade system would have been an easier, more direct approach to limiting our nation's global warming impact, we tried that here in this committee, and unfortunately we were unable to get it passed. But having said that, I want to point out that where I live in southwestern Pennsylvania, we're witnessing coal plant retirements nearly every month, which is impacting the economy and many of our constituents and potentially the reliability of the electric grid. Now, whether that's because of low natural gas prices, environmental regulations, or old age, the fact is we're taking a lot of old power plants offline and making it very difficult to build new ones. So the central tenet of the President's climate change plan is, of course, the new source performance standard for power plants. And it's been widely reported that the standard for new coal-fired power plants would require some type of CCS technology to comply. Now, I'm aware of and have supported the creation of several demonstration projects for CCS across the country, but I'm not aware that there's any one that would be considered BSER, you know, the best system of emission reductions as defined by the Clean Air Act. Can you tell me how CCS is going to achieve that requirement, that BSER be adequately demonstrated considering cost, energy requirements, and environmental impacts?
Congressman, first of all, it is good to be here. Thank you for the welcome. The first thing I would say is that relative to the retirements that you are discussing, we have been very strongly engaged with our energy colleagues to ensure that as retirements are happening, that we work with our energy office and our agency and others to make sure that those issues are managed effectively. And we do not see that there's any gap in our communication system in ensuring that we can achieve those regulatory standards effectively without threatening reliability. In terms of the rule that's coming out, I do not want to speak exactly to what the rule is going to say. It would be inappropriate for me to do that. But I will say that on the basis of information that we see out in the market today and what is being constructed and what is being contemplated, that CCS technology is feasible and it is available today. Now, that's not to give a signal about what's going on in the rule. That needs to be put into a broader as well as a more specific context, and we will meet our regulatory obligation to look at what's possible and what we should be doing for new future power plants. Frankly, the challenge is that we need to provide certainty for how you construct a coal facility in the future that will allow investment in that technology and allow the technologies that you're investing in to grow and become more and more competitive and lower those costs.
Let me ask you a little follow-up to that, because I'm aware of the Kempner plant in Mississippi that's been cited. Now, that plant's utilizing an innovative technique that pipes the carbon dioxide emissions to depleted oil fields. And uses the CO2 to force oil to the surface. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, that's a little less realistic for us unless we want to build a pipeline to Texas for our CO2, which I don't think is quite practical. I'm just curious, how is EPA taking into account the regional differences that there are from different places in our country as we look at these technologies? You know, this seems to be working, but it's not something that could work in my neck of the woods. And are you going to recognize, create guidelines that recognize the diverse fuel mix in our country, and specifically those regions like southwestern Pennsylvania that are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels?
Well, I think we all recognize that the use of CO2 that's captured in enhanced oil recovery becomes a very cost beneficial in the use of CCS. There's no question about that. But we also see part of that being, as a result, there are significant pipelines that are being constructed to take advantage of those cost considerations. Now, there's also an opportunity to sequester, which is, I think, demonstration projects and investments that the Secretary can speak to. But there's also products that are being produced at the end of these design systems that actually can be sold. So there's a variety of things that we see developing that make it very promising for coal to have a certain future, as the President intends in an all-of-the-above strategy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time.
Ms. Doyle, I might mention to you that this rule is expected out on Friday, I believe, the 20th, by the 20th, and we will be having a hearing on the proposed rule, or the issue. Thank you. On Saturday afternoon. Will you be able to be here on Saturday? At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
What an unexpected surprise to go this early. I appreciate that. So I'm going to start off by asking unanimous consent to put the letter of our Attorney General from Nebraska, his letter to Gina McCarthy, and a white paper that was done with other AGs into the record.
Without objection.
And, the date of the letter is September 11th, 2013. It's particularly, Ms. McCarthy, important to note that our Attorney General is involved in this because, A, it's an impact to our state, but B, we're a public power state. So he is the lawyer, in essence, for our public power states or our public power generators. And they have a concern on the rules that are being promulgated. I know they aren't finalized yet, but nonetheless, in regard to coal as a new fuel, we have old coal-fired plants that probably aren't going to make it. They aren't going to be able to adhere to the new rules. So the issue is, can we build new plants with coal, since we're only a couple hundred miles from the Powder River Basin, and this is by far the prominent feedstock for our generators. So I have, he has a question, and I have the same question, and that is that, does the EPA believe that it has the legal authority to eliminate coal as a fuel for new electrical generation?
We have the authority and responsibility to establish standards in the case of new facilities and guidelines where the individual states look at their own energy mix and come back to EPA with plans on how to comply. So I do think we believe that we're moving in a legally sound direction, but I would also caution you that one of the reasons we're reproposing, Congressman, is because there were a lot of comments on our original proposal. There were comments on the technology, there were legal concerns. So I would ask that we have this conversation in a more concrete way when the new source rule comes out, and to not also project what we're doing in the new source as being either appropriate or legally correct for existing facilities, because neither is the case.
All right. So I appreciate that answer, and this it would be easier if we had the final rule.
Well, we haven't even proposed one yet, sir. We're planning to re-propose a rule. So we will have certainly plenty of time.
Well, we certainly have concerns regarding our ability to use the cheapest and most readily available feed source for electrical generation.
Mr. Terry, if I may just interject one moment. We were truthfully so shocked by the original rule that we're anticipating with the new rule. So, sorry.
Well, and to follow up on that, though, is with the proposed, the newly to be proposed rule after the comments, is there still room for new coal electrical generation?
I think that the rule will provide certainty for the future of new coal moving forward, and I think in terms of existing facilities, we believe that coal will represent and represents now and will continue to represent a significant portion of the energy supply moving forward for decades to come.
All right. How about, there's been several questions regarding nuclear power as well, and can we even meet what the new greenhouse gas standards will be without nuclear power as part of the portfolio?
I don't think that the new source standard isn't designed to influence the existing portfolio. It is designed to ensure that future power plants that are being constructed take advantage of technologies that will ensure that they're as clean as they can be and have a path certain in a future that will be carbon constrained.
Well, it's important, I think, to have nuclear power which has basically zero greenhouse gas emissions
I think
to be part of our portfolio. And
the President certainly shares your concern that we make room for all fuels and all power generation types.
Yeah, we're going to grade on actions, not words. So I appreciate that.
If I may add on that, sir, I would note that we went through, in my view, a lot of years with words and not actions, and we are now seeing actions and not words. $8 billion loan guarantees for nuclear, new programs on small modular reactors. So I would say that we're walking the talk.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our distinguished witnesses for joining us today. I applaud the administration for taking on climate change, and I strongly support the goals of the President's Climate Action Plan to cut carbon pollution and better prepare our country for the impacts of climate change. Human-caused climate change is real, it is happening now, and it will continue to produce devastating effects unless we take immediate action. Failure to act in an urgent manner is short-sighted and detrimental to our environmental and economic interests. Some say that addressing climate change will cost too much money, but they neglect to consider the costs of inaction as well as the tremendous economic benefits of positioning our country as a global leader in clean energy. Clean energy industries currently employ hundreds of thousands of Americans, and the potential growth in this sector is enormous. My home district of Sacramento boasts 14,000 clean energy jobs. Throughout the United States, there are already 119,000 solar jobs and 80,000 wind jobs. Thousands more are employed in energy efficiency and other areas. This is a sector that could create millions of jobs and lead to faster economic growth. But we do have competition. According to the Pew Charitable Trust, last year China invested $65 billion in clean energy compared to only $36 billion in the United States. The U.S. ranked 10th in clean energy investments per dollar of GDP, behind China, all of Europe, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and Japan. Secretary Moniz, these other countries recognize the economic potential of clean energy. What are they doing to capitalize on it?
Are they meaning these other countries?
Yes.
Clearly, there's, I think people are seeing, frankly, trillion-dollar markets developing. They're developing now for clean energy to address climate, to address air pollution, just to advance technology. And certainly a country like China, as you know, is providing significant incentives for domestic manufacturing capacity.
Well, the United States has always been a leader in clean energy technologies, but clearly we're really facing these competitive challenges from abroad. The President's Climate Action Plan is a critical step to ensure not just that we address the dangers of climate change, but also that the United States can compete and lead in the clean energy economy of the future. Secretary Moniz, how will the President's Climate Action Plan spur clean energy innovation in the United States and create new clean energy jobs here at home? Do you believe that the United States can once again lead the clean energy revolution?
I certainly think we can and we must lead that revolution. I'll mention two ways in which we are moving forward. The one is, for example, through our continuing loan program to bring, as I said earlier, many technologies to the fore. I mentioned utility scale solar has been a huge success, and California has been a big part of that. But also the loan program for advanced fossil. So again, we're trying to go, and for nuclear, it's across the board for these technologies. Another different kind of initiative I alluded to earlier are things like the Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, where we want to capture things like 3D printing, which can apply to new energy technologies as well as a host of other technologies. So those are some of the things that we are moving forward.
Well, thank you. Now, my Republican colleagues are quick to argue that tackling climate change will hurt the economy. But in reality, climate change itself poses an enormous economic risk, and failure to address it could be a disaster for the global economy. In May, the CBO released a report concluding that delaying action to reduce carbon pollution would increase the expected damage from climate change by increasing the risk of very costly, potentially even catastrophic outcomes. The Clean Air Act provides a very good example how we can make steady progress in cleaning up the air while growing the economy. Since its enactment in 1970, the Clean Air Act has reduced key air pollutants in the United States by 2/3, while the economy has tripled in size. And Administrator McCarthy, what does the history of Clean Air Act tell us about our ability to cut pollution while building the economy?
Thank you for asking the question. We know that in our experience under the Clean Air Act, we've been able to significantly lower pollution, while at the same time GDP has risen and the economy has grown. We know that the economic goals do not have to conflict with our environmental standards, and we also know, in fact, that this country is where it is because we have both cleaned our environment, kept it safe and healthy for our families, recognized the public health value and environmental value that represents, while we develop an economy that respects those needs as well. We're asking for that same strategy to be employed as we tackle what I believe to be the most significant public health challenge of our time, which is climate change.
Well, thank you very much, and I ran out of time.
Gentlelady's time's expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think we can agree that the CO2 levels are undeniably increasing. And some scientists and climatologists have concluded that their energy models reflect that CO2 levels coincide with temperature increases. Now we were supposed to have some charts up here. These are the models that have been suggested by many of the scientists and climatologists. But however, these, as you well know, these models are key components of developing climate change policy. But unfortunately, as we're finding out, this was the projection, but here's the reality of temperature changes over the last 40 years. Now, actually, we can say over 40 years there's been almost no increase in temperature, very slight. In fact, over the CO2 levels have caused, even with increased the increased greenhouse CO2 level emissions, the Arctic ice has actually increased by 60%, as shown by the aerial view. Also, that the Antarctica is also expanding. But more importantly, this report coming out of the United Nations, the IPCC report coming up, is saying that most experts believe by 2083, in 70 years, the benefits of climate change will still outweigh the harm. That leads to the question today, what should be done about it? We hear the testimony from the administration that all climate change is man-made and America needs to reduce its CO2 emissions. Let's put this in perspective. Hypothetically, let's assume that all coal-fired generation in America were curtailed. All coal-fired generation were curtailed. According to the United Nations and the IPCC, this would reduce the CO2 levels of the globe by merely 0.2% by ridding all coal-fired generating power in the United States. The administration also needs to remind people, as you heard from the chairman in his opening remarks, that man-made problems, if we could, only represent 4% of all the emissions of the globe. Natural issues represent 96%. But so as a result, this administration is by virtue of these stream of job-killing regulations, is putting our nation at risk, all in the idea of clinging to the notion that cutting 0.2% is going to save the world's environment. Let me remind, the rest of the world is not listening. The President's energy policy is not being followed. China, India, Russia, and Europe are all expanding their use of coal. The administration is embarking now on a new global initiative, exporting uncertainty. According to the President, he's not going to allow low-interest loans to be made to developing nations around the world. Struggling nations to come out of poverty will continue to suffer. Lives will be lost, children will be sick and perish as a result of this President's support of this policy. One of the biggest moral responsibilities of the United States should be to help emerging nations come out of poverty. The most abundant and resourceful source of power is coal. For a nation to change from poverty, emerge from poverty, it must have access to energy. Energy for refrigeration, for cooking, and commerce. Just to give you an example, in the sub-Sahara of Africa, the total amount of power that they can generate in Africa is a 60-watt light bulb per person, a 60-watt light bulb for 3 hours a day. 60-watt light bulb for 3 hours a day. Why should they be denied access to affordable energy so they can come out of poverty? Please take this message back to the President. This President must not prevent people around the globe from obtaining affordable, dependable energy. And threatening American jobs over 0.2% of the of the CO2 emissions is not an acceptable energy policy. Crushing America's economy to reduce the CO2 levels by 0.2% is an abuse of his presidential authority. Now, if I could, in just the time, I'm just curious for both of you. The issue now is we're at 400 parts per million. Can you tell me what level do you want it to be? Is it what many people are promoting, 300 parts per million?
Yeah, you all can respond, but his time's expired.
Okay, I'd like to respond, Mr. McKinley. There's a lot of issues you raised there. If I may focus down for the sake of response. First of all, as I've said before in this committee, the issues in terms of the risks of climate change are not based just upon models. As I said, it's some pretty simple arithmetic. Number two, I don't believe anyone has ever said that, quotes, all climate change is man-made. The statement is that the anthropogenic forcings from CO2 are clearly of the scale that have long been expected to produce the kinds of change that we are seeing and will see. Third, I think we should address, there's many things, but let me focus on the hiatus, so-called, in the increase of warming temperatures. First of all, let's not forget, this decade is the warmest decade in recorded history. So it's not exactly like it's been cooling off. But secondly, the issues of decadal scale changes in the rate of increase are fully expected. El Niño, for example, are part of this. Those models at that time did not include other issues such as deep water warming, etc. I'll give you an example. There's an article right now in Nature whereby looking at the observed surface water temperatures in the Pacific, putting them in the East Central Pacific, putting them in, it comes completely with this hiatus, and it's only a hiatus in the constant global warming. So I believe we have to say this is a misreading of the record. The statement stands that anthropogenic CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions are a driver at the level of multiple degrees centigrade in this century. We're up 0.9 so far, and that is very consequential. In fact, I remind you that we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the greenhouse effect of water vapor, which has provided 60 degrees Fahrenheit of surface warming. We're just tuning that by a few degrees centigrade at great peril.
We've gone 2 minutes and 35 seconds over, so...
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that we put in the record a study by Dr. Benjamin Santer, atmospheric scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he says neither volcanoes, nor the sun, nor internal variability, nor any combination of those natural factors can plausibly explain the atmospheric temperature changes we've actually observed from space since 1979.
Without objection, and I also would like to put in the record your photo of how ice has expanded by almost 1 million square miles in the last year in the Arctic Circle.
Reserving the right to object, and I'd like to be recognized on my reservation.
Absolutely, recognized.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think this illustrates why we need a committee where we bring in the scientists. I just thought the statements that the gentleman from West Virginia read to us were incredibly inaccurate and contrary to everything else everybody in the scientific community has to say, including Mr. Moniz, who was an MIT professor for 40 years. He was the Department of Physics, head of the Linear Accelerator Center, Undersecretary of DOE, a PhD in theoretical physics from Stanford University. We need scientists to come in here and talk about science. Not
So, Mr. Waxman, are you objecting to this?
Well, I just want to make that point, but I will not object.
Okay, well, I won't object to yours either. And at this time, I'd like to recognize Dr. Christensen from the Virgin Islands for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really glad we're having this hearing. And, of course, I support President Obama's sensible plan to address climate change by reducing carbon pollution and helping communities to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And I really, in reading your testimony and hearing your testimony, I applaud the open approach to setting the standards that it has been engaging all and will engage all of the stakeholders in their concern in the process. Despite this, we continue to hear a lot of criticism of the President's plan from our Republican colleagues. And like our ranking member Waxman, I would simply ask, what's their plan? The President has said he's willing to work with anyone who wants to propose alternatives. And I'm glad that if Congress won't act, he will. And I'm also glad that both of you included in your testimony that the economy also benefits from the prior responses, has benefited from prior responses to climate change. My district in the U.S. Virgin Islands and the other territories are really on the forefront of this issue of climate change. And like our panelists from the Safe Climate Caucus Forum yesterday, already experiencing the impact of that change. In the Virgin Islands, we've already endured a serious coral reef bleaching event that significantly impacted our fisheries and by extension our tourism product and our economic stability. If we were to continue to do nothing, we could expect increased ocean acidification, sea level rise, which will impact our coastal infrastructure, and of course more intense storms, as much of the country is experiencing. So it's absolutely and abundantly clear that climate change is real and that we have to act. And it's important also, as was discussed with Congresswoman Matsui, that our country lead on this really vital issue. But as we respond, we also have to make sure that we transition to cleaner energy sources in a way that's workable, especially for communities with the greatest economic challenges. In the Virgin Islands and the other territories, we rely still very heavily on diesel generation. And at 53 cents per kilowatt today, electricity prices are the highest in our country. So we really have a strong incentive to scale up affordable renewable energy and energy efficiency, but it's going to take some time. So, Administrator McCarthy, I think you've answered my first question. I think you've made it clear that the rule you'll propose on Friday will apply only to new power plants.
That's correct.
And next you would start to work on a rule to reduce carbon pollution from existing power plants.
Yes.
So it's going to be particularly important for my constituents that we find cost-effective solutions that work for our specific circumstances, and I think the same is true for all of the territories and Hawaii, the state of Hawaii, given the high prices that we're already paying and the challenges related to being an island and where we're located. So I also have read in your testimony that you plan to work with the states and territories to ensure that you understand our specific circumstances as we do these things. So under the provisions of the Clean Air Act, do states and territories will they have the flexibility to achieve carbon pollution goals in ways that work for them? Do you anticipate that flexibility will be there?
That is correct.
Okay. And Secretary Moniz, as we look to the future of our energy supply system, do you see promising technology-based solutions that will allow places like the Virgin Islands and the other territories to meet our electricity needs with clean as well as affordable power? And what do you see as the most promising areas?
Yes, I do, and I also recognize that, in fact, islands often have the biggest challenge in that combination of risk and high energy prices. That's where, first of all, I think not being dependent upon particularly oil imports is very important, and that's where renewables can be very important. And also, I think there is an advantage. There's at least one advantage in an island setting, and that is transportation based upon electricity and/or natural gas can be more attractive because the driving range issues are not as important. So I think there's a real future for green islands, and we'd be delighted to work with you on that.
Where were we with ocean thermal conversion?
Well, ocean conversion,
it seems like would be a good source.
Yes, and so we continue to do research on that. That is a case where if you saw that curve that was shown earlier with cost dropping and deployment, we're still on the early stage of that curve. There's still a ways to go in terms of cost reduction, but the research is going on, and there are some pilot projects in various parts of the world.
Thank you. And my time is up. Thank you, Mr.
Gentlelady's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Patel, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. McCarthy, I want to ask a couple of questions of you. So one of the objectives today is identify greenhouse gas regulations that already existed and those in the future and how they actually impact the climate change, right? So you'd agree that we want to make sure we have a successful climate policy as a result of those sets of rules and regulations that you promulgate. Fair baseline statement?
In the context of a larger international effort, yes.
You bet. And on your website, you have 26 indicators used for tracking climate change. They identify various impacts of climate change. And so you would believe that the purpose of these rules is to impact those 26 indicators, right? So you put a good greenhouse gas rule in place, you'll get a good outcome on at least some or all of those 26 indicators.
I think that the better way to think about it, if I might, is that it is part of an overall strategy that is positioning the U.S. for leadership in an international discussion, because climate change requires a global effort. So this is one piece and it's one step, but I think it's a significant one to show the commitment of the United States.
Makes perfect sense. But you think it'd be reasonable to take the regulations you promulgate and link them to those 26 indicators that you have on your website? And no, so this is how they impacted it. It's
unlikely that any specific one step is going to be seen as having a visible impact on any of those impacts, a visible change in any of those impacts. What I'm suggesting is that climate change has to be a broad array of actions that the U.S. and other folks in the international community take that make a significant effort towards reducing greenhouse gases and mitigating the impacts of climate.
But these are your indicators, Ms. McCarthy. So these are the
They're indicators of climate change. They are not
precisely.
directly applicable to performance impacts of any one action.
How about the cumulative impact of your actions? Certainly, you're acting in a way, you say these are the indicators of climate change. Certainly it can't be the case that your testimony today is that your cumulative impact of your current set of regulations and those you're proposing isn't going to have any impact at all on any of those indicators?
I think that the President was very clear. What we're attempting to do is put together a comprehensive climate plan across the administration that has that positions the U.S. for leadership on this issue and that will prompt and leverage international discussions and actions.
So you're putting regulations in place for the purpose of leadership, but not to impact the indicators that you, the EPA, says are the indicators of climate change? I'm
Congressman, we're working within the authority that Congress gave us to do what we can, but all I'm pointing out is that much more needs to be done, and it needs to be looked at in that larger context.
So 2010 NHTSA, in your opening statement, you said we've gotten rid of a whole bunch of greenhouse gas, about 6 billion metric tons. How many, for example, one of your indicators is heat-related deaths. How many heat-related deaths have been eliminated as a result of the 2010 NHTSA rules?
You can't make those direct connections, Congressman. Neither can I.
Right. So there's literally no connection to the activities you're undertaking and to the.
I did not.
Well,
say
you
that.
said you couldn't make the connection. So tell me what I'm misunderstanding. Can you draw a connection between the rules you're providing, the regulations you're promulgating, and your indicators, or is it just on there?
I think what you're asking is, can EPA, in and of itself, solve the problems of climate change? No, we cannot. But the authority you gave us was to use the Clean Air Act to regulate pollution. Carbon pollution is one of those regulated pollutants. And we're going to move forward with what we can do that's reasonable and appropriate.
I'm actually not asking that question that you suppose that I'm asking.
Okay,
I didn't ask if you had the capacity to solve greenhouse gas issues. What I asked was, is anything you're doing any good as measured by the indicators that you've provided for green? So is your testimony today that you just have no capacity to identify whether the actions EPA has undertaken has any impact on those indicators? There's literally, this is about science, cause and effect. Is there any causal relationship between the regulations you promulgated and the 26 indicators of climate change that you have on your website?
The indicators on the website are broad global indicators.
They're not broad, they're very specific.
Of impacts associated with climate change. They are not performance requirements or impacts related to any particular act.
I actually like the indicators. They're quantifiable.
They're great.
Right? Heat-related deaths, change in ocean heat, sea level rises, snow cover. Those are great quantifiable things. But now what you're telling me is...
They indicate the public health impacts associated with climate change.
Exactly. But what you're telling me is you can't link up your actions at EPA to any benefits associated with those quantifiable indicators that the EPA itself has proposed as indicative of climate change.
I think what we're able to do is to show, I hope we will show this in the package that we put out for comment, is what kind of reductions are going to be associated with our rules, what we believe they will have in terms of an economic and a public health benefit. But it, again, is a part of a very large strategy.
Awesome. My time is up.
If I may just...
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from, I'm sorry, did you have a comment?
Well, I was going to comment briefly that there is an academic literature that does associate extremely hot days with mortality, and I'd be happy to provide that paper.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for calling this hearing on the Obama administration's climate action plan. And Administrator McCarthy, thank you very much for your leadership and willingness to assume the challenges as EPA Administrator, and it's good to see you today. And Secretary Moniz, same goes for you. Thank you for being here. Now, my Republican colleagues' arguments today relating to carbon pollution and the changing climate are reminiscent of their arguments and the arguments of special interests in the past when it comes to updating our standards relating to pollution and health standards in a clean environment. They predict, and they always do, we're going to have a rise in unemployment. The unemployment rate is going to skyrocket. They predict the economy will go into a tailspin if America tackles pollution and climate problems. It is an argument they raise every time America acts to set better standards for air, for water, for children's health. All you have to do is think back to the 1970s. I'm old enough to remember what the mornings were like before the Clean Air Act and how smoggy it was, and you would come out of your house and you could smell it and taste it. And then the country had the wherewithal to adopt the Clean Air Act. And over decades, our air has improved. Same can be said in the 1990s when it comes to acid rain. Can be said how America tackled the problem of chlorofluorocarbons that were depleting the ozone layer. The same can be said when it comes to cancer-causing chemicals and plastic. Plastic industry did not collapse, did it? There's probably more plastic around today than ever before. So I would say to my Republican colleagues, have confidence in America's ability to innovate in the face of significant challenges, challenges like climate change. And coming from a vulnerable state like Florida, I think what we see clearly ahead of us is there is a greater cost to inaction. Look at what citizens across my state and all across the country will face in rising insurance premiums when it comes to extreme events. We're debating flood insurance right now, and that is going to be tied more and more to the changing climate and sea level rise in the future. Think about what local governments and communities are going to have to do to invest in infrastructure. In the state of Florida, we're investing a great deal now to protect our clean water supply and the drinking water supply from the rising bays and oceans that are going to intrude on the drinking water supply, the saltwater intrusion. Communities are having to invest now to protect infrastructure, just the plain old pipes under the ground that we need to operate as a normal community all up and down the coast. So I see in the face of more droughts, more floods, longer fire seasons, more intense fires, faster sea level rise, it is very important that we take action. The cost ahead of us will be inordinate if the Congress continues to ignore it. So I'm glad that the administration is taking leadership here. Secretary Moniz, Administrator McCarthy, in general, let's talk about cost and benefits. When you propose a major rule, you are legally required to analyze the cost and the benefits of that rule. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
In fact, hasn't cost-benefit analysis been required for agency rulemaking ever since President Reagan signed an executive order on cost-benefit analysis in 1981?
That's my understanding, yes.
And it's called cost-benefit analysis because you are required to estimate both the cost and the benefits of government action. Is that correct?
That is correct.
If you didn't look at both the costs and the benefits, the information wouldn't help you assess the merits of a rule. If you only looked at cost, no rule would ever be worth it. In fact, Mr. Secretary, DOE recently issued a rule to require microwave ovens to be more energy efficient. As part of that rulemaking, DOE was required to estimate the cost and benefits of the new standards. By reducing the use of electricity, the rule will reduce air pollution, including carbon pollution. That's one of the benefits of the rule. Isn't that right? Did the rule include an estimate of cost of the carbon pollution that would be avoided by the rule?
Yes, it did, and indeed, the need to do that comes from also from a court ruling in 2007.
And how did you get to that number? Was it developed through an interagency process, and was it based on peer-reviewed science?
Yes, the process formally started in 2009. It's based upon 3 highly peer-reviewed models. There's been transparency on the models back in the 2009-2010. Every rulemaking then also opens up for comments going forward. The recent change in the numbers was strictly updating the peer-reviewed models, using them with the same inputs used previously.
Gentlelady's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for having a hearing today. And I also want to thank the Secretary and the Administrator for being with us today. I've appreciated the comments today. And Mr. Secretary, if I could start with a question to you. As the Chairman had earlier stated in his opening remarks, when the President came into office, Congress took under consideration what was essentially his climate plan. Congress considered whether we would embark on a complicated and expensive regulatory program that was intent on massively decarbonizing our energy supply and raising our energy costs. And we were told the U.S. must take the lead. Mr. Secretary, do you think it's economically wise for the U.S. to unilaterally implement policies that result in more expensive energy costs for American households and manufacturing? And this question is really important for a district like mine because I have 60,000 manufacturing jobs. And I spend all of my time on the road going through large, medium, small plants across my district. And what was happening here in Washington affects these plants. and affects jobs back home. So, again, do you think it's economically wise for the U.S. to unilaterally implement policies that can result in more expensive energy for these manufacturing facilities and for American households?
Well, first of all, in no small part due to the shale gas boom, we are actually seeing lower costs in many industries.
Well,
and a growth in
if I could just interrupt for a minute, because like in the state of Ohio, 78% of our energy is coal-based.
Yeah. So, well, again, across the country, certainly we are seeing more manufacturing, lower energy prices. And in fact, in Ohio, there's also the issue of developing shale gas now. Secondly, in terms of the U.S. moving forward, I would say that, number one, American leadership is indispensable if we are going to have international action. But secondly, there's very much, I believe, the self-serving interest of developing the new technologies that will, in fact, give us a strong position in a future multi-trillion-dollar market.
Okay, just continuing on with that, if I could just continue on with the questions to you. Again, in the Climate Action Plan, and again in that Climate Action Plan, and also in your testimony, we're talking about the 3 pillars there that you mentioned, and the third point being that the United States needs to lead that international effort, and especially when we're talking about the climate issues. And what does the administration mean by the U.S. taking that leadership role? And does this mean that we're supposed to be the first nation that decarbonizes our energy supply on a very large scale and expects the rest of the world to follow, or what's that leadership?
I would say it means that, first of all, we do lead in clean energy, and I believe we do lead for sure in clean energy innovation. We have to help deploy it. We are working, for example, the Department of State, in terms of the quotes, if you like, the policy level, has made tremendous progress in the G20 context and with China in terms of HFCs. And at the Department of Energy, we are working through a variety of mechanisms. For example, we lead what's called the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is advancing dialogues with other countries. For example, in many countries now, we have active dialogues going on where our companies are working with companies in those countries. I'll mention countries I've been in, Brazil, for example, recently. Yesterday in Vienna, discussion Monday with Turkey, et cetera. They are very interested in our technologies for industrial energy efficiency. This is a market for our companies to go out there, both services and technology. That's what we mean by leading.
And then also I see from your testimony on page 8, you talk about you're finalizing the rule covering the standby power microwave ovens, and you go on with proposals for the lamp fixtures, commercial refrigerators, and commercial walk-in coolers and freezers. And I guess the question is, are there any other appliance rules that you see that are being planned in the future?
Yes, indeed, and I'd be happy to supply a list of those. The next one, we've said the next proposed rulemaking, we hope to advance in November on electric motors.
Okay, and if you have any other appliances that you see coming up in the future, if you could supply that to the committee,
certainly, I'd be happy to provide a list. And I might add that in addition to the rulemaking, we are, when it's appropriate, for example, right now with set-top boxes, we are pursuing voluntary discussions because, frankly, when the industry and consumers can come together and agree on a rule that we think is good, that will actually get the rule implemented faster. So we work both on the rulemaking and on convening voluntary approaches to efficiency standards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olsen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. And like you and Chairman Manners Barton and many colleagues on my side of the aisle, I'm disappointed that so many of the administration's experts working to justify and put out new rules on new carbon rules decided not to educate the public by testifying here this morning. The 2 out of 13 ratio, attendance ratio, does not bode well for the most open, transparent administration ever. But I'm sure we'll find out where these people are, and these people might do their jobs after we leave here. But we do have the few and the proud. Secretary Moniz, Administrator McCarthy, welcome. My question will focus on refineries, the U.S. energy renaissance, and power grid issues in Texas. First of all, refineries. Ms. McCarthy, much of today's discussion has been about the President's carbon plan. It's been about the power sector. But I also worry about EPA's next steps for the refineries. Less than 1 month ago, your EPA announced that the Houston area was on track to attain ground-level ozone standards by 2018. Your EPA put out a press release that said, and this is a quote, "These reductions are even more impressive given Houston's rank as one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country," end quote. But rather than recognizing success, EPA is already working on more strict ozone and so-called Tier 3 rules. And we keep hearing rumors of new rules for greenhouse gases in the refining space. All this could mean billions of dollars, billions in compliance costs. These costs will hit families hard and be passed on to average drivers across the country in places like Sugar Land, Pearland, and Katy, Texas. So briefly, I say briefly because I'm limited time here, can you tell me what to expect, when to expect these carbon rules for refineries? What window of time frame, ma'am?
I don't have a time frame for you.
No time frame, okay. Will you commit to study the cumulative costs of all these rules when we consider the impacts of carbon regulations on refineries?
I will certainly commit to following whatever protocols we're required to do, sir.
In following what I call the Chairman Emeritus Dingle rule, answering yes-no questions, yes or no, can you guarantee that your rules will not raise gasoline prices? Yes or no?
I don't know what rules we're referring to, and I would never make guarantees to anything, sir.
Okay, all right. Further line of question, this is about the U.S. energy renaissance. As you know, Ms. McCarthy, carbon emissions from the United States have fallen in recent years despite these new regulations, without these new regulations. And there are many factors, but a significant reason is their increased use of American natural gas. Mm-hmm. And again, the Dingle rule, yes or no. Do you agree that hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling have created an American energy renaissance that is helping to slash our carbon emissions? Yes or no?
I believe, yes or no. It's a complicated question. I'll take it very short. I believe that certainly the new technology has advanced our ability to capture natural gas domestically. That has been a wonderful thing from both air quality as well as domestically. And I think that answers your question.
I'll take that leading yes to the whip count there. Yes or no? Would carbon emissions be higher today if fracking were banned or regulated out of existence? Yes or no? No fracking, higher emissions.
I can't make that direct connection, sir. You're asking me really complicated questions for yes, no.
Okay, I don't think it's that complicated, but the answer is pretty clear. I think it's yes.
But no, you know.
And one final question. This is for you, Secretary Moniz, as well. My home state, as you know, is in desperate need of new reliable power. At a time when we're looking at blackouts in 2014 and 2015 without more power generation, the EPA is considering carbon rules that could essentially mandate partial carbon capture and sequestration. And now, I'm not opposed to CCS. As we discussed earlier, in testimony came here a couple months ago, my district is actually home to one of the only CCS modifications in the country, the WA Paris plant outside of Neville, Texas. Mm-hmm. Again, another yes-no question. Secretary Moniz and Ms. McCarthy, do you believe that CCS technology is currently economic for most coal plants, not just the Paris plant in Neville, Texas? which is viable because we have oil and gas right there, right on the property. They can get the carbon there quickly.
As I said earlier, I mean, the combination of CCS with EOR is very attractive. If I may add just one thing, Mr. Chairman, just to go earlier, since this issue has come up many times about the two of us being here, I just want to say that, first of all, there's been no trouble occupying 3 hours with two of us. But secondly, I know my colleagues, our colleagues across the administration, would be delighted to have a conversation about all of these issues. So,
thank you very much. Gentlemen's time has expired. And I will say to you that you're right. It took up a lot of time today. We are going to get back in touch with those other agencies and either meet with them individually or through a letter exchange. So we are going to follow up with them. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kensinger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you both for being here and for your service to your country and for the last few hours you've given us. Mr. Secretary Moniz, I've heard you speak in favor of the President's Climate Action Plan, and to that extent I understand the concerns surrounding the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions being expressed. That being said, statements from energy experts have said electrical prices are projected to have increased over 40% since 2001, which is well above the rate of inflation. And will continue to rise due to the requirements of EPA clean air and environmental standard. In addition to this, over 60% of our nation's clean power generation actually comes from nuclear power, which is virtually emissions-free, and I'm very concerned with the efforts of your agency in regards to the future of the nuclear energy sector. I believe that any serious plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions must have a strong nuclear component, yet the number of nuclear plants that have announced their retirement this year has grown to almost epidemic proportions, and more are expected in the near future. Let me just ask you first off, what are your goals, and keep it as brief as possible, what are your goals for the growth of the nuclear energy sector overall?
Well, first of all, the closures obviously have a bunch of factors. In one case, there was an equipment issue in California. Sure. In Vermont, it's principally
but a lot of it's age. We haven't built new
gas.
Plants in 20
They're
years.
older.
So. Understood.
But we have for years already we, the Department of Energy, before I was there, supporting things like life extension technologies, et cetera. So that's one direction. Another is the still working on the provisional loan guarantee for the Vogtle plants. It's really important to get some of these new plants built.
Has the DOE actually closed any of those loan guarantees?
No. So on
no,
but on nuclear,
why not?
Just the Vogtle. It's an ongoing negotiation.
Because it's been a while, I know. So I know. I mean, because I hear the discussion about it.
All I can say is that I have taken a direct interest in this.
Okay, because I mean, from our perspective, I hear the administration use it, and in fact, I heard you a number of times today use the loan guarantees as promise for, hey, we support it, but these are all conditional; they're not finalized, and when you have a number of plants closing because of the age of these plants, and we're very slow to replace that capacity. And let me ask you this. Do you believe that the greenhouse gas targets set out by the administration can be met without the use of nuclear power?
Clearly, the 17% goal for 2020 is that you're referring to, which we're kind of almost halfway there. Clearly, if there are a lot of nuclear power plant closures in that time, that'll certainly make it more difficult.
And I know this is just, we're asking you to guesstimate. How many more nuclear plants do you think could be put out of commission before those targets would become unattainable?
On that, I do not know, but I can tell you that I am hoping to have discussions with the industry, try to understand better where that is going. I mean, nuclear power plants that exist still do have pretty low marginal costs, which make them attractive. But as we know, the lower natural gas prices has lowered the clearing price in many parts of the country.
Absolutely. And again, I want to make the point of what we were talking about earlier, that there are no loan guarantees in existence right now. They're conditional. Let me, and I'll just say, to finish up, I won't take all my time. Hold your applause, please. If the administration was serious about addressing climate change, I think it would harness the clean energy from nuclear power, as we've been talking about. At a minimum, it would follow the law. I heard a lot of discussion about following the law today, and it would reconstitute the Yucca Mountain program and provide a solid basis for the NRC to issue new plant licenses. And so I thank you for your time today. I thank you for your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Well, we are following the law.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, you all may have noticed Ms. Schakowsky is over here, and we've sort of ignored Ms. Schakowsky. And she's a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, but she's not a member of this subcommittee. So traditionally, we finish all the subcommittee members before we go to Ms. Schakowsky. And Mr. Griffith, Ms. Schakowsky, has said that he's noted you sitting over there patiently, so I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes if you'd like to ask your questions now. Because he's
well, I thank you both, especially Mr. Griffith, for that courtesy. I believe that the threat to at least human life on our planet is the greatest challenge that humankind has faced. And I feel so strongly that this Congress is in a moment of such great opportunity where we could take leadership on behalf of the United States, on behalf of the countries around the world, that we could benefit economically. This is a moment of great opportunity that I fear, as a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, that we are squandering. And I look at some of the young people in this audience. This is their century, and I feel an obligation that we try and do something about this. I would like to see if either of you have a comment about this issue of coal and the ruling that this promulgated ruling that's about to come out. Some of the charges that it would have basically an insignificant effect on climate change, and that it actually would jeopardize the economic opportunities of people in poor countries and further impoverish them. That's a pretty heavy charge. I wonder if you, Madam Administrator, could give us some answer to.
I'll be happy to
Secretary
begin. What I would say is that the reason why the power plant sector is one of the first places to go to regulate carbon pollution, because it is by far the largest industry sector in terms of its generation of greenhouse gases. The second reason is that there are opportunities to reduce greenhouse gases, and that will position us in the energy future. And I think there's every reason why we should want to tee up ideas and options for how to do that effectively, taking advantage of modern technologies that we can take advantage of and escalate their introduction both in the U.S. As well as internationally. That's what's going to make significant differences, not just what we're doing here, but its impact in moving cleaner technologies forward. The issue of the international discussion, I think that you will see that the language in the President's Climate Action Plan is very detailed on this issue. It in no way steps back from both the intent of the United States and our obligation to work with the developing countries to ensure that they mature and provide energy for their citizens. And the language in here is not inconsistent with that goal. It will not minimize our efforts towards that goal. What it does say, however, is that we need to be careful about how we're investing, and we don't want developing countries to make mistakes that we might have made in not positioning themselves for the best technologies available in a carbon-constrained world.
I would just add that the Climate Action Plan, as far as the things like the Ex-Im Bank, does have an exclusion for the least developed countries.
I see. Let me just say that how much I appreciate your being here, and the fact of having the EPA administrator and the Secretary of Energy at a single hearing. I'm sure we will have, and I hope you will have, an opportunity to hear others. But, you know, that's not an everyday occurrence, and I want to thank you for that. I also want to associate myself with Mr. Waxman's plea that has been made more than once, that we have scientists come in and talk to us. And we can, you know, have the kind of forum where the science could be challenged, could be questioned, where if there's differing opinions. But I'm wondering, in the seconds I have, is there really a significant difference of opinion about the science of climate change?
Well, again, I would argue that at the level of the broad impacts, in my view, there is none. I think there's, again, very, very simple arguments as to why this is expected. I also observe that the pattern of effects was predicted decades ago. This is not somehow being made up. Clearly, there are specific, when you start drilling down to specific issues, it's very complicated science. So earlier we had a discussion about the last several years have seen a slowdown of warming. This, and as I pointed out, this is not out of the expectations on decadal scales, but that's a case where the scientists are still having some argument over the specific driver. Recent papers I gave as one example have linked essentially the El Nino, La Nina issues to that, but that's an example of something that still remains to be worked out. It does not obviate the overwhelming conclusion and the overwhelming support for what's going on in terms of global warming.
Gentlelady's time has expired. This time, recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Did appreciate the comments about using, as we move forward, so that we don't impoverish the other nations and impoverish our own nation, that we use modern technologies as we move forward. The problem that I think we have, and I would say that the countering plan is that we ought to make sure those technologies are available first before we put regulations in place that then cause us to lose an entire segment of our population's jobs and our energy production, etc. And that's been my concern all along. And coming from a coal-producing region, I can tell you that the policies already, not even counting the ones that are going to come out later this week or ones that may come out in the next few months, are devastating the economy of my district. And it was it's quite moving when you see these people. These are hard-working men and women who are out there trying to do jobs. It's not just the coal miners. It's the jobs that are reliant upon the coal mines. And, you know, every time I turn around, there's another manufacturing company that was reliant on the coal industry that's going out of business, or that needed affordable electricity that's going out of business. There's another coal mine. About every other week I'm losing a coal mine in my district. That's people who were making about $75,000 a year that aren't making it now. And then probably the biggest blow that any of my communities has received, and while in fairness the two first factors they listed were the double-edged scissors of Obamacare, they also listed the fact that the economy is so poor in the area, and it's a coal-producing part of my district, and we just lost a hospital in my district. And so now some of my constituents are going to have to drive an hour and a half to get to cardiac care in a hospital. This is not a good thing. And when we look at that cost-benefit analysis, we don't always look at the fact that if people don't have the ability to afford the electricity in their homes, that they then have to cut back on things, and they have to cut back on some important things. If you can't heat your home effectively in the wintertime, and in the mountains of Virginia, sometimes it gets pretty cold, that can affect your health. If you're having a problem with your heart, and all of a sudden, instead of being able to go to the local hospital because of policies enacted here in Washington, you have to drive an hour and a half to get to heart care, that's going to have an impact on your health. There's just no way around that. And I think that we need to look at these things. And when we say that, oh, this is all going to be grand and all going to be great, I think we have to get the science and the breakthroughs and the technological breakthroughs out there first before we say we're going to shut down a lot of coal power plants because the technology is not out there for everything that needs to be done in order to make them 100%. And I don't think that and when you look at poverty, and I noticed that the gentleman earlier referenced a German article, how electricity became a luxury good. I don't think that the people of the United States of America consider electricity to be a luxury good, and I don't think we want to be at the point where they have a minister, in this case you, Ms. McCarthy, in equal, the German environment minister, Peter Altmaier, giving out tips on how you don't preheat your oven to do cooking, and maybe if you lower the contrast and the brightness on your television, you can bring down your electric bill, because the Germans have put themselves in a position where people can't afford it. I don't want that for my country, but it's hitting my district hard right now. And so I hope that you would take that into consideration. And along with those things, I know that the President outlined a goal of 17% reduction in 2005 greenhouse gas levels by 2020. And he mentioned that also at a climate speech in June at Georgetown University.
and I heard Mr. Secretary say earlier that we're about halfway there. I guess my question is that from programs from the EPA, or is that from plant shutdowns? And how much have the programs that the EPA has enacted brought down those greenhouse gases in the last 5 years? Can you give me quantify how much the programs have brought down?
Let me just put the goal in a little bit of perspective. I think that goal clearly was stated in the Climate Action Plan, but in no way does that Climate Action Plan say that those actions are going to add up to that 17%. It is a start at looking at the most economically viable opportunities.
And do you know,
to grow
did the 17%, and I apologize, my time's running out, did the 17% come from, was that just a number that was picked out of the air, or was there some scientific basis for it, and can you give me that basis?
I believe that it was an international goal that was stated. There is certainly some analytics, but it was not directly associated with that plan, but it remains a goal that we'd like to achieve.
And do we know, I mean, I understand we know we're going to try to reduce those greenhouse gases, but do we know specifically how much each program will give us? And that being said, if you could get that to me later, because my time is just about out. Ms. McCarthy, I truly believe when you're here to testify, and I've told people in my district that I think you do care about the plight of folks. And so I would ask you to commit, whether it's my district or one of the other districts in Central Appalachia that's been hit so hard, if we set up a trip, would you come down and see what's happening in the district to the people and where the jobs are just disappearing? There's lots of towns with empty storefronts, and it looks like a ghost town.
I'll follow up directly with you on that.
All right, I appreciate that very much. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
If I could just say that about half of the reduction so far have been from the shale gas revolution, purely market driven, and another part of it has been from especially in the transportation sector, the efficiency standards holding demand down there.
Which were based on regulations. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Dingle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that I am applauding our committee for finally having a hearing on climate change. I want to say that it's obvious to me and to everyone else the science is undeniable, and it's time for us to act, and Congress has been ducking this issue, even going so far as to deny the basic science behind climate change. I've seen the devastating effects right in my area. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, my district suffered huge devastation. Rising seas, stronger storms, and greater flooding will only increase if we choose to do nothing. So with Congress unwilling to act on the issue, I'm very happy the President has acted, has decided to act. And though some may deny the existence of climate change, the science is clear. If people object to the specifics of the President's plan, then they should propose their own plan for curbing carbon pollution and climate change, and the committee should actively pursue this matter. We also know from experience that government can regulate pollution without hurting the economy. In fact, many of the ideas that will help reduce carbon pollution will also grow new industries in renewables, carbon capture technology, and other new technologies that will help mitigate climate change. So, Secretary Moniz, let me ask you, you mentioned in your testimony the devastation that Sandy wrought upon New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. One of the major issues arising from that was the loss of power and the length of time that it took to return. Can you speak to what the Department of Energy is doing in regard to electricity reliability and how that works with the President's climate change plans?
Yes, thank you. One of the particular, I'll mention two areas. One is in the context of our general work on the kind of the electric grid of the 21st century. We are folding in very heavily resilience issues as well as the kind of renewables and other drivers of that technology. And I mentioned earlier that one specific project we just had it announced in New Jersey, looking at a microgrid to support a major transportation corridor, which, by the way, would also be an important evacuation route for New Yorkers. The second thing, which is very important, and we are working closely with industry, with API, American Petroleum Institute, and the EEI. What we learned in Sandy, a little bit the hard way, was how the electricity infrastructure and the transportation fuels infrastructures are so interdependent. And so we are working on that and being positioned for any future event.
So implementation of these plans is ongoing. We can expect that soon.
Yes, yes, it is. We hope to have a little a product that we will put out at the end of the month, for example.
Thank you. I've been a long supporter of alternative fuels for transportations. Besides electric vehicles that you mentioned, what are other alternative fuels is the Department of Energy working on?
Well, we certainly support, and particularly for heavy vehicles, looking at the issue of natural gas as a transportation fuel. We, of course, have a very extensive program on advanced biofuels, moving to cellulosic biofuels, for example. And these are, again, a case where costs are coming down quite dramatically. Not quite there yet, but coming down dramatically. And, of course, electrification. Again, costs have dropped dramatically. Not yet for the long-range vehicle for the mass market, but the penetration is happening much faster than it did at the comparable stage for hybrid vehicles, looking very, very interesting. And then more to the future, the hydrogen economy and fuel cells, that remains kind of a little bit earlier in the development. But I would say alternative liquid fuels and electricity are looking actually quite interesting.
Thank you. I know you've both been here a long time, so Administrator McCarthy, I'm going to submit a couple of questions for you and spare you from having to answer it. But I thank both of you for your hard work. And
gentlemen from New York, if
yes.
you've completed your questions, I would like to just make you yield to me the time.
Yes, sir.
I just want to make a comment on the hearing, which I think has been an excellent hearing. But we are at a critical crossroads in this country and our energy policy. And if we decide to do nothing, which I sense is what the Republicans want, is to do nothing, it's going to lead to more carbon pollution, more droughts and floods and other extreme weather events, more billion-dollar disasters and relief bills to pay for them by the taxpayers. If we take that path, history will not treat us kindly. We'll be the generation that ignored the warnings of scientists and left future generations a violent and inhospitable climate. On the other hand, there's another path. We have a shrinking window for action, but we still have a window to act. And Secretary Moniz told us that this is the critical, crucial time, this decade. If we act now, if we invest in solar, wind, and other clean energy sources, if we unleash American ingenuity, we can stop carbon pollution, protect our atmosphere, and create millions of new clean energy jobs. I want to thank the two witnesses who have been very, very helpful and terrific in being here all this time. I hope we'll all put aside our partisan differences to help achieve these goals. They're very important ones for the future of our country and the rest of the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. And I would also say how much we appreciate the two of you being here today. We do think it's a major accomplishment that our CO2 emissions are lower than they've been in 20 years. And as we move forward, I think we all want a balanced approach. We want to protect the environment, but we also want to make sure that we have a strong, viable economy and that we don't want to be left in a non-competitive position in the world marketplace. So, and I hope that you all will look as forward to being with us in the future as we look as forward to being with you again here. We spent 3 or 4 marvelous hours together. And that will conclude today's hearing, but I would remind visitors that, members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask that the witnesses all agree to respond promptly to the questions that we submitted to you all. And so thank you again, and we look forward to working with you as we move forward.
Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. That concludes today's hearing.